Welcome, weary travelers of the Grand Line, to the extraordinary chronicle of one who carries the weight of forbidden knowledge upon her shoulders. Tonight, we trace the complete journey of Nico Robin, from a child branded as demon to the woman who would unlock the world's greatest mysteries. This is a tale of solitude transformed into belonging, of knowledge preserved through unimaginable sacrifice, and of a scholar whose very existence challenged the foundations of the world itself. So settle into peaceful slumber as we explore every shadow, every revelation, and every moment of connection that shaped the archaeologist of the Straw Hat Pirates. In the year 1970, on a small island in the West Blue where ancient knowledge flowed like gentle streams through corridors of learning, a child was born who would one day carry the weight of forbidden truth upon her shoulders. The island of O'Hara rose from azure waters like a monument to human curiosity, its most distinctive feature the massive tree of knowledge that had grown for over 5,000 years, its trunk so vast that an entire library had been carved within its living wood. This was no ordinary island, no simple collection of fishing villages and farming communities that dotted the calmer seas of the world. O'Hara had dedicated itself to a singular purpose that elevated it above the mundane concerns of commerce and conquest, the pursuit of knowledge in its purest form. The scholars who made their home beneath the tree of knowledge were not mere academics pursuing comfortable theories in ivory towers, but dedicated seekers of truth who understood that genuine understanding required courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to facts, regardless of how uncomfortable those facts might prove. The tree of knowledge itself was a marvel that defied easy description, its interior hollowed by generations of careful cultivation into a repository that housed the largest collection of books and historical documents in the known world. The shelves that lined its living walls contained texts in languages that had been forgotten by most of civilization, accounts of events that predated the establishment of the world government, and research into questions that pushed against the boundaries of what was considered safe to investigate. Within this sanctuary of learning, where the very air seemed thick with the accumulated wisdom of ages, Nico Robin drew her first breath. Her mother, Nico Olvia, was among the most accomplished archaeologists of her generation, a woman whose passion for uncovering historical truth burned with an intensity that would ultimately reshape her daughter's entire existence. The Nico family had served the cause of archaeology for generations, their names synonymous with careful scholarship and fearless investigation into mysteries that others preferred to leave undisturbed. But motherhood, it seemed, was not sufficient to contain Olvia's burning need to pursue the ultimate archaeological prize, the true history of the world that had been systematically erased from official records. When Robin was merely 2 years old, still learning to form her first words and take her first tentative steps, Olvia made the decision that would define both their lives forever. She entrusted her daughter to her brother and his wife, Roji, and set sail in pursuit of the stone monuments known as poneglyphs, ancient markers that contained information the world government had declared forbidden to seek. The house where Robin would spend her formative years sat in the shadow of the great tree, close enough that she could see scholars coming and going at all hours, their arms laden with books and their faces marked by the particular intensity that came with genuine intellectual pursuit. Yet within that house, she would discover that blood relationships carried no guarantee of warmth or acceptance, that the title of family could be claimed by those who possessed no understanding of what such bonds were supposed to provide. Roji, her aunt by marriage, viewed Robin's presence not as a blessing or even a simple responsibility, but as an unwelcome burden that had been thrust upon her without consultation or compensation. The woman's resentment manifested in countless small cruelties, sharp words delivered when Robin asked innocent questions, physical punishment for infractions that existed more in Roji's imagination than in any objective reality, and a systematic campaign to make the child understand that she was not wanted, not valued, not considered truly part of the family she had been forced to join. The isolation that Robin experienced within her own home was perhaps more devastating than simple neglect would have been. Roji made it clear through both word and action that Robin was expected to remain invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself, to exist as quietly as possible, so as not to disturb the routine that had been established before her arrival. Family celebrations became exercises in exclusion. Meals were endured in tense silence, and even the simple comfort of physical affection was withheld, as if love were a finite resource that must be carefully rationed. Yet, even in this environment of systematic rejection, Robin's natural intelligence and curiosity refused to be suppressed. She possessed from her earliest years a mind that sought patterns, that asked questions, that refused to accept simple answers when complex truths lay waiting to be discovered. The books that filled even ordinary homes on Ohara became her escape and her education, their pages offering glimpses into worlds where knowledge was valued, where questions were welcomed, where the pursuit of understanding was considered noble rather than inconvenient. The tree of knowledge called to her with a pull that seemed to operate below the level of conscious thought, its presence a constant reminder that somewhere acceptance and understanding might be found. The scholars who passed by her window were figures from another world, beings who had dedicated their lives to ideals that transcended the petty concerns of domestic harmony and social respectability. In their focused expressions and animated discussions, Robin glimpsed possibilities for her own future that extended far beyond the narrow confines of her current existence. Professor Clover, the elderly director of the archaeological research, first encountered Robin when she was barely old enough to reach the higher shelves in the library. Her appearance in spaces traditionally reserved for adult scholars should have been cause for removal, yet something in her demeanor, the careful way she handled ancient texts, the reverent attention she paid to information that others... Roji made it clear through both word and action that Robin was expected to remain invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself, to exist as quietly as possible, so as not to disturb the routine that had been established before her arrival. Family celebrations became exercises in exclusion. Meals were endured in tense silence. Within those living walls, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, she discovered what family was supposed to feel like. The scholars who worked there accepted her presence not as an unwelcome intrusion, but as evidence that their work would continue into the next generation, that the pursuit of truth would survive their individual mortality. Here, among dusty tomes and ancient artifacts, Robin found the sense of belonging that had been denied her in the house where she was supposed to feel safe. The scholars treated her questions with respect, encouraged her natural abilities, and provided the kind of intellectual stimulation that her developing mind craved. They saw in her not a burden or an inconvenience, but a remarkable young person whose potential deserved nurturing rather than suppression. The archaeological examination that would formally recognize Robin as a scholar despite her tender age of 8 was less a test than a confirmation of abilities that had been obvious to anyone willing to pay attention. Her answers demonstrated not just memorized knowledge, but genuine understanding of archaeological principles, historical methodology, and the complex relationships between different fields of study. The moment when Professor Clover announced her success was perhaps the first time in her life that Robin experienced pure, unqualified pride in her own accomplishments. But even this triumph carried within it the seeds of future tragedy. Robin's announcement that she, like her absent mother, wished to pursue the forbidden history of the world's lost century was met not with encouragement, but with stern warnings about the dangers such research could bring. Professor Clover's reaction revealed the tension that existed even within O'Hara's scholarly community, between the pure pursuit of knowledge and the practical necessity of survival in a world where certain questions were considered too dangerous to ask. The true history that Robin dreamed of uncovering was not mere academic curiosity, but the key to understanding how the current world order had been established, what alternatives had been suppressed, and why the world government considered certain information so threatening that they would kill to prevent its revelation. The void that existed in historical records was not accidental but systematic, the result of deliberate efforts to ensure that future generations would never question the foundations upon which their society had been built. The scholars of O'Hara understood better than most the risks they courted through their research, yet they continued their work because they believed that truth, once discovered, carried its own moral imperative to be preserved and shared. They were guardians, not just of books and artifacts, but of humanity's right to understand its own past. Protectors of knowledge that powerful forces would prefer to see destroyed rather than revealed. For young Robin, growing up surrounded by such dedication to principle, the choice seemed obvious. She would follow in her mother's footsteps regardless of the dangers such a path might entail. The world's secrets called to her with the same irresistible pull that had driven Olvia to abandon everything familiar in pursuit of forbidden truth. She possessed the intelligence necessary for such research, the determination required to pursue it despite obstacles, and the moral courage needed to face whatever consequences such knowledge might bring. The years that followed her formal recognition as a scholar were marked by intensive study that went far beyond what might have been expected from someone her age. Robin immersed herself in ancient languages, historical methodology, and archaeological techniques with the focused intensity of someone who understood that time might be limited, that the opportunity to learn might not always be available. The tree of knowledge became more than her refuge. It became her university, her church, her home in every way that mattered. The other scholars watched her development with mixture of pride and concern, recognizing in her enthusiasm for forbidden subjects an echo of the passion that had driven her mother to risk everything in pursuit of ultimate truth. They could see the potential for greatness in her careful handling of ancient texts, her intuitive grasp of historical patterns, her ability to make connections between seemingly disparate pieces of information. Yet they also understood the price that such gifts might demand, the isolation and danger that awaited anyone who chose to challenge the world's carefully constructed version of its own past. The island itself seemed to hold its breath during these years, as if sensing that forces beyond its control were gathering strength, that the peaceful existence its scholars had maintained for generations was approaching its end. The research into poneglyphs had progressed further than the world government suspected, revealing truths that struck at the very heart of their authority. The void century was beginning to yield its secrets, and those secrets were more dangerous than anyone had imagined. In her quiet moments, when the last scholars had departed for their homes and the tree of knowledge stood silent in the darkness, Robin would sometimes climb to the highest accessible point in the library and look out across the waters that surrounded her island home. Somewhere beyond the horizon, her mother pursued the same truths that called to her own heart, following a path that would either lead to the greatest archaeological discovery in history or to destruction so complete that nothing would remain but memory and regret. The child who had been unwanted in her own home had found purpose among the guardians of forbidden knowledge, acceptance among those who understood that some questions were worth asking regardless of the cost. She could not have known that her peaceful existence was balanced on the edge of a precipice. that forces were already in motion that would transform her from scholar to survivor, from seeker of truth to living embodiment of everything the world claimed to fear. The demon child had not yet been born, but the conditions for her creation were already falling into place, waiting only for the spark that would ignite them into the conflagration that would consume everything she had ever known or loved. The devil fruit that would forever alter the trajectory of Robin's existence arrived on O'Hara not through any grand design or prophetic vision, but through the simple accident of circumstance that seemed to govern so many of life's most consequential moments. The Hana Hana no Mi sat innocuously among other treasures salvaged from a shipwreck that had washed ashore during one of the island's fierce winter storms, its swirled patterns and unusual coloration, marking it as something extraordinary, yet providing no hint of the profound changes its consumption would bring. At 6 years old, Robin possessed the kind of curiosity that adults often found both charming and exasperating, her questions endless, and her desire to understand the world around her seemingly insatiable. The strange fruit that had been placed temporarily in the Tree of Knowledge's collection room called to her with the same irresistible pull that drew her to ancient texts and mysterious artifacts. Its appearance was unlike anything she had ever seen, not quite the shape of any familiar fruit, its surface covered with spiraling designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The scholars who should have recognized the significance of such an unusual specimen were distracted by more pressing concerns, their attention focused on deciphering recently acquired poneglyph rubbings that might contain crucial information about the Void Century. In their dedication to uncovering ancient secrets, they overlooked the modern mystery that sat within arm's reach, the devil fruit that would transform one of their own into something the world would struggle to understand or accept. Robin's consumption of the fruit was motivated not by hunger, but by the kind of innocent experimentation that characterized her approach to everything unknown. The taste was unlike anything she had ever experienced, simultaneously sweet and bitter, familiar yet alien, carrying flavors that seemed to change even as she chewed. The immediate aftermath was unremarkable. No sudden transformation, no obvious change in her physical condition, no dramatic revelation of newfound abilities. It was only hours later, as she attempted to reach a book on a high shelf in the library, that the first manifestation of her new powers occurred. Her frustration at being too small to access the volume she wanted triggered an unconscious response from abilities she did not yet understand she possessed. An additional arm sprouted from the bookshelf itself, extending down to grasp the desired text and hand it to her with casual efficiency that defied every law of anatomy and physics she had ever learned. The shock of seeing her own arm emerge from an inanimate surface was profound enough to cause the duplicated limb to vanish immediately, leaving Robin to wonder if she had imagined the entire incident. But the book remained in her hands, solid proof that something extraordinary had occurred, evidence that she had somehow transcended the normal limitations of human anatomy through means she could not begin to comprehend. The experiments that followed were conducted in secret, hidden from the scholars who might have viewed such abilities with scientific fascination rather than the mixture of wonder and fear that seemed to be Robin's natural response. She discovered that she could sprout not just arms, but any part of her body, from virtually any surface within a certain range, that these duplicated limbs possessed all the strength and dexterity of her original appendages, and that they could be maintained for varying lengths of time, depending on her concentration and the complexity of the task she wished to perform. The tactical applications of such powers were immediately obvious even to a child. The ability to reach objects from impossible distances, to perform multiple tasks simultaneously, to see around corners by sprouting eyes in strategic locations, to hear conversations by manifesting ears in hidden spots. But Robin's first instinct was not to exploit these capabilities for personal advantage, but to understand them to determine their limits and possibilities through careful experimentation that reflected her scholarly training, even at such a young age. The isolation she had always experienced within her own home took on new dimensions as her abilities developed. Roji's existing hostility was amplified by superstitious fear when she witnessed Robin's powers for the first time. The sight of additional arms sprouting from her niece's body, triggering reactions that went beyond mere discomfort into something approaching terror. The woman's verbal abuse, already harsh, became tinged with religious condemnation as she declared Robin's abilities to be unnatural, demonic, evidence of some fundamental corruption that marked her as different from decent, normal people. The other children of Ohara, who had already maintained careful distance from the strange girl who lived in the shadow of the Tree of Knowledge, found new reasons to avoid her company once word of her powers spread through the island's small community. The manifestation of extra limbs from surfaces around her created an atmosphere of unpredictable threat that made casual interaction impossible. No one could feel comfortable in the presence of someone whose abilities operated according to rules they could not understand or anticipate. The whispered conversations that Robin began to overhear painted her as something monstrous, a creature whose very existence violated the natural order that governed normal human lives. Parents warned their children to stay away from her, not out of specific concern about harm she might cause, but from generalized fear of the unknown, the instinctive human response to anything that challenged their understanding of what was possible or acceptable. The word demon began to attach itself to Robin's name with increasing frequency, spoken sometimes in hushed tones of genuine fear, and sometimes with the casual cruelty that children deployed against anyone who failed to conform to their narrow definitions of normalcy. Each repetition of the term carved deeper wounds in her developing sense of self, creating associations between her unique abilities and moral corruption that would influence her self-perception for decades to come. The scholars at the Tree of Knowledge provided the only refuge from this systematic rejection, their scientific training allowing them to view Robin's powers with curiosity rather than fear. Professor Clover, in particular, took great interest in her abilities, recognizing them as manifestation of what ancient texts referred to as devil fruits, legendary items that granted supernatural powers in exchange for the user's ability to swim. His fascination was purely academic, driven by desire to understand rather than to exploit or condemn. Yet, even within the scholarly community, Robin's powers created complications that had not existed before their manifestation. Her ability to sprout body parts in unexpected locations made privacy difficult to maintain, conversations hard to keep confidential, research challenging to conduct without fear of observation. The scholars found themselves modifying their behavior in subtle ways, checking corners for manifestations of eyes or ears before discussing sensitive topics, creating an atmosphere of mild paranoia that had never existed in their previously open community. The development of Robin's combat capabilities was driven more by necessity than by any aggressive instinct, her powers proving useful for self-defense in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to her existence. She learned to create barriers of arms to block attacks, to use sprouted limbs to trip or restrain opponents, to manifest body parts at strategic locations, to create confusion and misdirection during confrontations. These techniques were developed through trial and error rather than formal training, each application teaching her more about the possibilities and limitations of her unique gift. The psychological burden of possessing abilities that marked her as fundamentally different from everyone around her was perhaps heavier than any physical challenge her powers might present. Robin found herself constantly aware of the reactions her mere presence could provoke, calculating the risk of using her abilities even for innocent purposes, living in a state of perpetual alertness that exhausted her emotionally, even when her body remained physically rested. The loneliness that had characterized her early years deepened as her powers developed, the natural human desire for connection coming into conflict with the reality that her abilities made genuine intimacy difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. How could she form close relationships when potential friends feared her capabilities? How could she trust others when her powers allowed her to spy on them without detection? How could she maintain normal social interactions when every gesture might be interpreted as threat rather than friendship? Professor Clover's attempts to provide guidance during this difficult period were hampered by his own lack of understanding about what psychological effects such isolation might produce in a developing child. His scholarly training had prepared him to analyze historical patterns and archaeological evidence, but offered little insight into the emotional needs of a young person struggling to integrate supernatural abilities with normal human development. His kindness was genuine but limited, his support meaningful but insufficient to address the deeper wounds that systematic rejection had carved into Robin's psyche. The other adults on the island who might have provided assistance or understanding were prevented from doing so by their own fears and prejudices. Their inability to see past Robin's unusual abilities to recognize the vulnerable child who desperately needed acceptance and guidance. The community that might have supported her through this challenging transition instead became another source of stress and rejection, transforming what should have been a time of growth and discovery into an extended period of defensive isolation. The fragments of information that reached Robin about her mother's quest took on new significance as her own abilities developed. The knowledge that Olvia was pursuing forbidden research providing context for her daughter's emerging understanding of what it meant to be different, to possess knowledge or capabilities that others found threatening. The parallel between her mother's dangerous scholarship and her own dangerous powers was not lost on someone whose intelligence had always operated far above her chronological age. The dreams that began to visit Robin during this period were filled with visions of acceptance and belonging that reality consistently failed to provide. Imaginary communities where her abilities were valued rather than feared. Fictional families who embraced her differences rather than condemning them. These nocturnal fantasies provided temporary escape from the harsh realities of her daily existence, while simultaneously highlighting the depths of her isolation and need for genuine human connection. The increasing sophistication of her power applications reflected not just growing skill, but deepening understanding of how far she stood outside normal human experience. Each new technique she mastered was another step away from the possibility of conventional relationships, another barrier between herself and the kind of simple, uncomplicated friendships that other children took for granted. The very abilities that made her unique also ensured her solitude, creating a paradox that would define her existence for years to come. As Robin approached her 8th birthday, the same age at which she would be recognized as a scholar, her isolation had crystallized into something approaching acceptance of her fundamental difference from everyone around her. She had learned to find satisfaction in academic achievement rather than social connection, to seek fulfillment in the pursuit of knowledge rather than the warmth of human relationships. The patterns established during these formative years would influence every relationship she attempted to build throughout her life. The learned assumption that acceptance was temporary and betrayal inevitable, shaping her approach to trust and vulnerability in ways that would prove difficult to overcome. The devil child had been born not through any single moment of transformation, but through the gradual accumulation of rejection and fear that her powers had provoked in everyone around her. The abilities that should have been a gift had become a curse. The unique capabilities that might have brought wonder, instead bringing isolation. The powers that could have made her extraordinary, instead making her alone. The stage was set for greater tragedies to come. The foundation laid for conflicts that would transform a brilliant child into a fugitive, a scholar into a survivor. a seeker of knowledge, into a living symbol of everything the world claimed to fear most. The arrival of Jaguar D. Saul on O'Hara's northwestern beach came not through any grand design or prophetic intervention, but through the simple mechanics of ocean currents and human desperation. The giant vice admiral had washed ashore like driftwood after days adrift in waters that had tested even his extraordinary constitution, his massive frame battered by storms and exhaustion, yet somehow still clinging to the life that lesser beings might have surrendered to the merciless sea. Robin's discovery of this unexpected visitor occurred during one of her solitary walks along the coastline, expeditions that had become routine escapes from the increasingly stifling atmosphere that pervaded both her home and the scholarly community where she sought refuge. The sight of a figure nearly 3 times the height of any human she had ever encountered should have triggered fear or at least caution, yet something in Saul's demeanor, perhaps the obvious vulnerability of his exhausted state, or the gentle quality of his expression, despite his intimidating size, encouraged approach rather than flight. The friendship that developed between the 8-year-old scholar and the displaced Marine officer was built on foundations that transcended their obvious differences in size, age, and life experience. Saul possessed a philosophy of joy that had somehow survived decades of military service and exposure to the worst aspects of human nature. His belief in the healing power of laughter, serving as antidote to the darkness that had begun to accumulate in Robin's young heart. His signature laugh, that distinctive "de shi shi shi" that emerged from deep within his massive chest, became for Robin a sound associated with acceptance and unconditional friendship. The 4 days they spent together, while Saul constructed his makeshift raft, were perhaps the happiest of Robin's life up to that point, marking the first time she had experienced genuine companionship with someone who viewed her abilities not as frightening aberrations, but as fascinating manifestations of the world's infinite variety. The giant stories of distant seas and strange islands provided glimpses into possibilities that extended far beyond the confines of O'Hara, visions of a world where difference was celebrated rather than condemned, where unusual abilities were treasured rather than feared. Saul's reaction to learning Robin's identity carried implications that would not become clear until much later. His recognition of the Nico name and its connection to archaeological research, creating visible tension in someone whose casual demeanor had previously seemed unshakable. The revelation that he knew her mother, that Olvia had been a passenger aboard his ship during her escape from Marine custody, transformed their innocent friendship into something fraught with political significance and moral complexity. The warning that Saul delivered about the approaching Bustacall fleet carried weight that went far beyond simple military intelligence, his knowledge of marine tactics and capabilities providing context for the scale of destruction that was bearing down on O'Hara's peaceful shores. The battleships that were converging on their position represented not mere law enforcement but systematic annihilation, the complete eradication of everything and everyone connected to the island's forbidden research. The concept of a Bustacall was foreign to Robin's experience, her scholarly education having focused on ancient history rather than contemporary military doctrine. Saul's explanation of the protocol's purpose, the elimination of threats to world government authority through overwhelming destructive force, provided her first real understanding of the stakes involved in her mother's research, the recognition that the pursuit of historical truth could provoke responses that transcended normal bounds of law enforcement or judicial process. Olvia's return to O'Hara occurred simultaneously with the arrival of the Marine fleet, her escape from custody having been facilitated by Saul's intervention during a crisis of conscience that had transformed a loyal vice admiral into a fugitive from his own service. Her homecoming should have been a moment of joy and reunion, yet circumstances had conspired to make it instead a race against time. a desperate attempt to warn the scholarly community of their impending destruction. The reunion between mother and daughter was complicated by years of separation and the immediate urgency of their situation. Emotions that should have been processed gradually, instead compressed into moments of crisis that allowed no time for proper reconciliation. Olvia's decision to prioritize warning the other scholars over spending precious time with Robin reflected the harsh mathematics of their situation but created wounds that would never fully heal. The child's desperate need for maternal connection sacrificed to the greater necessity of preserving what knowledge they could from the coming conflagration. The scholars' refusal to abandon their research despite clear warning of approaching annihilation demonstrated the depths of their commitment to principles that transcended personal survival. Their understanding that some knowledge was too precious to be lost, even if preserving it meant accepting death. The Tree of Knowledge represented more than their life's work. It embodied humanity's right to understand its own history, a principle they considered worth defending, even against impossible odds. The arrival of CP9 on O'Hara's shores marked the beginning of the end for everything Robin had ever known or loved. Their systematic efficiency in identifying and neutralizing threats, serving as prelude to the larger devastation that would follow. Spandam's presence as mission commander introduced an element of sadistic pleasure into what might otherwise have been merely ruthless but professional execution of orders. His obvious enjoyment of the power he wielded over helpless civilians, revealing the corruption that could flourish within systems designed to protect rather than terrorize. The discovery of poneglyph research within the Tree of Knowledge provided the official justification for what was about to unfold, though the scale of the response had been predetermined, regardless of what evidence might or might not be found. The world government's reaction to threats against its version of history was calibrated not to the actual danger posed, but to the symbolic importance of preventing any challenge to their narrative of legitimacy and necessity. Professor Clover's attempt to reveal the true nature of the ancient civilization they had been researching represented a final act of scholarly courage, his willingness to share dangerous knowledge, even in the face of certain death, demonstrating the principles that had guided his entire career. The abrupt termination of his transmission before he could speak the forbidden name illustrated the lengths to which the world government would go to prevent certain truths from being revealed, their fear of historical fact exceeding their concern for due process or basic humanity. The bombardment that followed transformed O'Hara from haven of learning into inferno of destruction with mechanical efficiency that spoke to years of planning and preparation for such contingencies. The cannons that rained death from the sky were operated by Marines who had been told they were preventing a threat to world stability. Their willingness to participate in genocide testament to the power of propaganda to transform ordinary people into instruments of systematic evil. Robin's desperate flight through streets filled with fire and debris marked her transition from sheltered scholar to survivor. The comfortable certainties of her academic existence replaced by the immediate necessity of avoiding death, while witnessing everything she had ever cared about being systematically destroyed. The sight of flames consuming books that had survived for centuries, of scholars who had dedicated their lives to knowledge being cut down by faceless Marines, of an entire civilization's intellectual heritage being reduced to ash and memory, would haunt her for the rest of her life. The final confrontation between Saul and Vice Admiral Kuzan represented more than a battle between former colleagues, but a clash between competing visions of justice, duty, and the proper limits of government authority. Kuzan's reluctance to participate in the destruction of O'Hara was evident despite his ultimate compliance with orders, his internal conflict manifesting as hesitation that created crucial opportunities for Robin's escape, while failing to prevent the larger tragedy from unfolding. Saul's defeat and gradual freezing provided a masterclass in dignity in the face of certain death. His continued laughter, even as ice encased his massive form, serving as final demonstration of the philosophy that had guided his life. His last words to Robin carried weight that extended far beyond their immediate context, the encouragement to find friends who would accept her for who she was, rather than what others claimed she represented, becoming a guiding principle that would influence every relationship she attempted to build throughout her life. The destruction of the evacuation ship by Admiral Sakazuki eliminated Robin's last hope of conventional rescue, while demonstrating the extremes to which the world government would go to prevent potential leaks of classified information. The casual murder of innocent refugees on the mere possibility that they might carry dangerous knowledge revealed a system so committed to controlling information that it considered mass slaughter an acceptable price for maintaining its pawn version of truth. Olvia's final sacrifice in the burning tree of knowledge, her choice to preserve what books she could rather than ensuring her own survival, provided Robin with a model of principled action that would influence her understanding of when personal safety should be subordinated to larger purposes. The image of her mother surrounded by flames, throwing precious texts into the ocean in hopes that future generations might recover them, became a symbol of resistance against forces that sought to erase inconvenient truths from human memory. The books that the scholars hurled into the sea with their dying breaths represented more than mere preservation of information, but an act of faith in humanity's future. The belief that someday, somewhere, people would value truth enough to seek out knowledge that had been declared too dangerous to possess. Each volume that escaped the flames carried with it the hopes and dreams of an entire scholarly community, their final contribution to the cause they had served throughout their lives. Kuzan's decision to spare Robin's life was motivated by curiosity about what had driven Saul to sacrifice everything for a single child. His willingness to create an ice path for her escape, demonstrating that even within the world government's machinery of oppression, individual conscience could sometimes prevail over institutional imperative. His warning that he would personally hunt her down if she proved to be a threat established parameters that would govern their relationship for decades to come. The sight of O'Hara burning behind her as Robin sailed away on Saul's hastily constructed raft marked not just the end of her childhood, but the birth of the legend that would define her existence for the next 2 decades. The 8-year-old girl, who had dreamed of following in her mother's footsteps as an archaeologist, was transformed in a single night into the world's most wanted fugitive, a living symbol of everything the world government claimed threatened the stability of civilization itself. The bounty of 79 million berries placed on Robin's head was unprecedented for someone her age, the massive sum serving both practical and symbolic purposes in the campaign to ensure her capture or death. The lie that she had personally sunk 6 Marine warships provided cover for the true reasons behind her persecution, while simultaneously creating a myth that would grow in the telling, transforming a traumatized child into a monster in the public imagination. The photograph that would appear on wanted posters throughout the world captured Robin at her moment of greatest vulnerability, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of her loss. Yet this image of grief and innocence would be interpreted by most who saw it as evidence of evil, the world government's propaganda machine transforming obvious trauma into apparent malevolence through the simple expedient of controlling the narrative that surrounded it. The ice that carried Robin away from the burning ruins of her home began to melt as soon as Kuzan's power no longer sustained it, forcing her to rely on her own nascent sailing skills to navigate waters that stretched endlessly in all directions. The physical challenge of survival at sea paled in comparison to the emotional devastation of processing loss so complete that it defied comprehension. The recognition that everything and everyone she had ever cared about had been eliminated in a single night of systematic destruction. The stars that guided Robin's navigation during those first desperate hours of freedom were the same constellations that had watched over O'Hara for thousands of years, their light carrying across impossible distances to illuminate a path forward for the last survivor of a civilization that had valued truth above safety. Each point of light in the darkness above seemed to whisper encouragement, reminding her that even in the deepest night, guidance could be found for those who knew how to look for it. The morning that brought rescue also brought the first newspaper headlines that would transform Robin from victim into villain, the world government's version of events spreading across the world with the efficiency that only state-sponsored propaganda could achieve. The narrative that emerged bore little resemblance to the reality she had experienced. Yet it would become accepted truth for most people who encountered her story through official channels. The ship that found her drifting in the wreckage of her former life carried sailors who had already heard preliminary reports about the demon child of O'Hara, their mixture of curiosity and fear, providing Robin with her first taste of how the world would view her for the rest of her life. The kindness they showed was genuine but temporary, their basic human decency ultimately overcome by the bounty that had been placed on her head, and the systematic campaign to portray her as a threat to everything decent people held dear. The photographer who captured Robin's image for her wanted poster worked quickly and efficiently, understanding that his subject was valuable only as long as she remained uncaptured. The resulting image would become one of the most recognizable faces in the world, though few who saw it would understand the tragedy it represented or the injustice it embodied. The demon child of O'Hara had been born in flame and trauma, forged in the crucible of systematic oppression, and cast into a world that would hunt her relentlessly for the crime of surviving what was meant to be complete annihilation. The legacy of that terrible night would follow Robin across oceans and through decades, shaping every relationship she attempted to build and influencing every decision she made about trust, vulnerability, and the possibility of genuine human connection. The scholars of O'Hara had died, believing that knowledge was worth any sacrifice, that truth would ultimately prevail over propaganda, that somewhere in the future their sacrifice would be vindicated by people brave enough to seek understanding despite the risks such knowledge might entail. Their faith would be tested through 20 years of darkness before finding its ultimate validation in the bonds of friendship that would finally convince Robin that some people were indeed worthy of the trust that had been so consistently betrayed throughout her youth. The first ship that rescued Robin from the wreckage of her former life carried within its hold the seeds of every betrayal that would follow. The crew's initial kindness slowly curdling into avarice as news of her massive bounty spread through the vessel like a contagion of greed. The sailors who had pulled her from the water with genuine compassion found themselves calculating the reward that her capture might bring, their basic human decency gradually overcome by the practical considerations of survival. In a world where 79 million berries could transform ordinary men into legends of wealth and comfort, the world government's propaganda campaign had begun even before Robin's feet touched dry land again, their version of the O'Hara incident spreading through official channels with the mechanical efficiency that only state-sponsored lies could achieve. The narrative they constructed bore no resemblance to the reality of scholars dying to preserve knowledge, of a child traumatized by witnessing genocide, of an entire civilization erased to protect comfortable falsehoods. Instead, the world learned of a demon child who had personally destroyed 6 marine warships, a monster whose very existence threatened the stability that kept ordinary people safe from chaos and destruction. The myth of the demon of O'Hara grew in the telling, each repetition adding new details that made Robin seem more monstrous and less human, transforming a traumatized 8-year-old into a figure of supernatural evil that parents used to frighten disobedient children into compliance. The devil fruit powers that she had once viewed as fascinating extensions of her natural abilities became proof of her corruption in the eyes of those who heard the stories, evidence that she had trafficked with forces beyond normal human understanding to gain abilities that violated the natural order. The newspapers that carried her wanted poster to every corner of the world made no attempt to provide context for the massive bounty or the serious charges listed beneath her photograph. Readers saw only a child's face marked with tears that were interpreted as evidence of remorse for terrible crimes rather than grief for unimaginable loss. The propaganda machine transforming obvious trauma into apparent malevolence through the simple expedient of controlling the narrative that surrounded every image and every word. The first betrayal came from the crew that had saved her. Their decision to turn her over to marine authorities motivated not by justice or civic duty but by simple greed dressed up in the language of moral obligation. The captain, who had initially shown her kindness, explained his decision with words that would become depressingly familiar over the years that followed. She was dangerous. Her presence put innocent people at risk. The world would be safer with her in custody or dead. The money was merely incidental, he claimed, though the gleam in his eyes suggested otherwise. Robin's escape from that first capture required the full application of abilities she had barely begun to understand, her devil fruit powers manifesting in ways that confirmed every prejudice her would-be captors had developed about her supposed monstrosity. The sight of additional limbs sprouting from surfaces throughout the ship, of eyes appearing in impossible locations to spy on their conversations, of hands emerging from shadows to unlock doors and disable weapons, transformed fear into terror and convinced even those who might have shown mercy that she was indeed the demon the newspapers claimed. The farm where Robin found temporary sanctuary after her escape represented everything she had lost when O'Hara burned. Its peaceful routines and simple pleasures, offering glimpses of the normal childhood that circumstances had stolen from her. The old woman who ran the small homestead showed her genuine kindness that seemed unconnected to her notorious reputation, providing not just food and shelter, but the kind of maternal care that had been absent from her life since Olvia's final departure. For several months, Robin allowed herself to believe that she might have found a place where her past did not matter, where her abilities could be hidden well enough to prevent discovery, where the simple pleasure of honest work and human companionship might prove more valuable than any bounty the world government had placed on her head. She helped with the harvest, learned to milk goats and gather eggs, discovered the satisfaction that came from contributing to something larger than her own survival. The betrayal, when it came, was perhaps more devastating than any that would follow, because it destroyed the fantasy that such normalcy might be possible for someone marked as she had been. The old woman's revelation that she had contacted the authorities, her angry demands that the government agents pay her the promised reward for turning in the demon child, shattered Robin's naive hope that kindness might exist without conditions or ulterior motives. The agents who arrived to collect their prize showed no interest in determining whether Robin had actually committed the crimes attributed to her, their casual discussion of her execution, revealing that justice had never been the goal of her pursuit. She was valuable to them not as a criminal to be tried, but as a symbol to be destroyed, living proof that the world government's authority could not be challenged without consequences that extended across generations. Robin's flight from the farm was complicated by the emotional attachment she had formed to a place and person that had provided temporary respite from the constant fear that had become her normal existence. The old woman's curses followed her into the darkness, accusations of betrayal and ingratitude that cut deeper than any physical wound because they transformed Robin's attempts at human connection into evidence of her own moral corruption. The pattern established by this first major betrayal would repeat itself with minor variations throughout the 20 years that followed, each iteration teaching Robin new lessons about the futility of trust and the dangers of allowing herself to become attached to people or places that could be taken away without warning. She learned to read the signs of impending betrayal, the subtle changes in body language that preceded violence, the careful questions that indicated someone was gathering information for later use against her, the gradual shift from welcome to wariness that marked the end of every temporary sanctuary. The couple who offered her work and shelter next seemed more security conscious than the farm woman had been, their remote location and defensive preparations suggesting they understood the risks involved in harboring someone with Robin's reputation. Their kindness appeared genuine, their acceptance of her unusual abilities suggesting that perhaps she had finally found people who could see past the propaganda to recognize her essential humanity. The illusion lasted longer this time, nearly a year of relative peace that allowed Robin to develop skills beyond mere survival, to contribute meaningfully to the small community that had formed around the couple's homestead. She learned to fight more effectively, to use her powers in ways that complemented rather than simply supplemented conventional combat techniques, to think strategically about problems that extended beyond her own immediate safety. The discovery of their planned betrayal came through careless conversation overheard during one of her routine reconnaissance patrols, the couple's discussion of timing and logistics, revealing that they had been planning her capture almost from the moment she had arrived. Their kindness had been calculated, their acceptance a performance designed to keep her docile until circumstances allowed for her profitable disposal. The pain of this second major betrayal was different from the first, less shocking but more deeply wounding, because it confirmed suspicions that Robin had been trying to suppress about the true nature of human relationships. If even those who had seemed to understand and accept her were ultimately motivated by greed rather than genuine care, what hope existed for ever finding people who could be trusted without reservation? Her departure from the couple's homestead was marked by their angry denunciations of her character, their claims that she had betrayed their trust and kindness through her ungrateful refusal to accept capture quietly. The psychological manipulation inherent in such accusations was perhaps more damaging than any physical abuse they might have inflicted. The attempt to make her complicit in her own victimization by suggesting that resistance to betrayal constituted moral failure. The pirate crew that Robin joined at age 8 offered a different kind of sanctuary, their own status as outlaws creating apparent common ground with someone who had been branded an enemy of civilized society. Pirates, she reasoned, would have no interest in turning her over to marine authorities, since they faced similar risks from government pursuit themselves. Their acceptance of her unusual abilities seemed natural in a context where supernatural powers were common and valuable rather than feared and condemned. The months she spent with this crew provided her first real education in the mechanics of survival in a hostile world, teaching her skills that scholarly education had never addressed and experiences that academic knowledge could not provide. She learned to fight not as intellectual exercise but as matter of life and death, to think tactically about problems that involved violence and deception, to understand the economic realities that drove people to risk everything for the chance at wealth and freedom. The betrayal that ended this period of relative stability was perhaps the most instructive of all the treacheries she experienced, demonstrating that even outlaws would sacrifice their own members when the price was right and the risks seemed manageable. The crew's assumption that she had somehow led Marine forces to their hideout revealed the paranoia that her reputation created in everyone around her. the belief that her very presence attracted the kind of attention that no one could afford to endure. The curses that followed her as she fled from yet another group of people who had claimed to accept her carried new varieties of venom. Accusations that she was a bringer of misfortune whose presence doomed everyone around her to disaster and death. These claims, while factually incorrect, contained enough emotional truth to wound deeply, reflecting the reality that association with her did indeed carry risks that most people were unwilling to accept indefinitely. The years that followed blurred together into a repetitive cycle of temporary acceptance followed by inevitable betrayal, each iteration teaching Robin new survival skills while simultaneously eroding her capacity for trust and emotional investment. She learned to compartmentalize her feelings, to enjoy whatever kindness was offered while maintaining psychological distance that would minimize the damage when betrayal inevitably came. The dog that shared her shelter during one particularly difficult period became her most reliable companion during these dark years, its simple loyalty uncompromised by bounty considerations or political calculations. The animal's eventual death from starvation. Despite Robin's attempts to share her meager food supplies, provided a lesson in the harsh mathematics of survival that would influence every relationship decision she made thereafter. The shop owner, who struck her with a stick for daring to enter his establishment, represented the casual cruelty that had become routine in her daily existence, the automatic rejection that her reputation provoked even in people who had never heard the full details of her supposed crimes. The physical pain was negligible compared to the accumulated weight of such systematic dehumanization, the constant reminder that she existed outside the boundaries of normal society. The organization she joined at age 16 offered more sophisticated shelter than the crude pirate crews of her childhood, their resources and connections providing better protection from marine pursuit while demanding more complex forms of service in return. Her archaeological knowledge proved valuable to people who trafficked in historical artifacts. Her unique abilities useful for acquiring items that conventional theft could not reach. The betrayal that ended this association was motivated not by bounty considerations but by strategic necessity, the organization's leadership determining that her continued presence posed risks that outweighed her contributions to their operations. The clinical nature of their decision-making process, the complete absence of personal animosity or moral judgment, somehow made this rejection more wounding than the passionate denunciations she had previously endured. The transition from teenager to young adult was marked by gradual changes in how others perceived her threat level and potential value. Her growing skills and reputation creating new categories of people who might find her useful enough to temporarily overlook her dangerous reputation. The criminal organizations that began to court her services operated according to more sophisticated risk-benefit calculations than the simple greed that had motivated her earlier captors. Her entry into the Grand Line at age 23 represented a milestone that few pirates achieved. Her survival through 2 decades of constant pursuit, demonstrating capabilities that commanded respect even from those who might otherwise have considered betraying her for the bounty. The increased danger of these more challenging waters was offset by the greater acceptance of unusual abilities and complicated histories among those who had chosen to make their living in the world's most treacherous seas. The arrival in Alabasta and her eventual meeting with Crocodile marked the beginning of the longest period of stability she had experienced since O'Hara's destruction, though stability was perhaps too generous a term for an alliance built on mutual exploitation and carefully maintained mistrust. The warlord's need for her unique abilities created a situation where betrayal carried costs that exceeded potential benefits, establishing for the first time in her adult life a relationship where her value as ally outweighed her worth as captive. The 4 years she spent as Miss All Sunday provided opportunity to develop skills and confidence that had been impossible to cultivate during the constant flight that had characterized her earlier existence. Working within Baroque work's complex hierarchy taught her lessons about manipulation and misdirection that complemented her natural intelligence, creating a skill set that would prove invaluable in the challenges that lay ahead. Yet even this longest of sanctuaries was built on foundations too fragile to support genuine security. The alliance with Crocodile maintained through careful balance of leverage and necessity that could shift without warning if circumstances changed. Robin understood better than most that her position was ultimately temporary, that even the most advantageous arrangement would eventually reach its conclusion through betrayal, completion of objectives, or simple evolution of interests beyond the bounds of their original agreement. The psychological armor that Robin had developed through 20 years of systematic betrayal served her well in the dangerous games that defined life in the Grand Line. Yet it also created barriers that made genuine human connection increasingly difficult to achieve or maintain. She had learned to enjoy whatever pleasures were available while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for survival when those pleasures inevitably ended, a skill that served her professional interests while slowly eroding her capacity for the kind of vulnerability that meaningful relationships required. The habits of suspicion and self-protection that had kept her alive through 2 decades of pursuit had crystallized into personality traits that would prove difficult to abandon, even when circumstances finally offered the possibility of genuine safety and acceptance. The woman who would eventually join the Straw Hat Pirates carried within her the accumulated wounds of every betrayal she had experienced, invisible scars that would influence her ability to trust and be trusted long after the immediate dangers of her fugitive existence had been replaced by new forms of security and belonging. The reflection that stared back at her from mirrors during this period showed someone who had grown beautiful despite the harshness of her existence, yet the eyes that returned her gaze carried shadows that spoke to experiences no child should have endured, and losses no adult should have been forced to accept. The demon child of O'Hara had survived her first 20 years of freedom, but the cost of that survival was measured not just in physical hardships, but in the erosion of basic human capacities for trust, hope, and the kind of innocent faith in others' goodness that makes genuine intimacy possible. The sands of Alabasta stretched endlessly beneath a sun that seemed to burn with the intensity of divine judgment, creating a landscape where mirages danced on the horizon, and the very air shimmered with heat that could drive lesser beings to madness. It was in this unforgiving realm of ancient mysteries and modern conspiracies that Nico Robin would find her longest sanctuary since the destruction of O'Hara, though sanctuary was perhaps too generous a term for an alliance built upon the careful balance of mutual exploitation and barely contained mistrust. Sir Crocodile's reputation preceded him across the Grand Line like a shadow cast by wings of ambition and ruthlessness. His status as one of the 7 warlords of the sea, providing him with legitimacy that masked purposes far darker than the world government suspected. The man who had earned the epithet of Desert King possessed abilities that made him master of Alabasta's harsh environment, his Suna no Mi powers allowing him to command the very sands that had shaped the kingdom's history and would determine its future. Robin's arrival in the desert nation had been motivated not by any grand design but by the practical necessities that governed her nomadic existence, the need to disappear from areas where her reputation had begun to attract unwanted attention, the constant search for places where her unique skills might prove valuable enough to justify the risks her presence inevitably brought. Alabasta offered both anonymity among its cosmopolitan population and opportunities for archaeological research that could advance her ultimate goal of uncovering the true history hidden within the world's scattered poneglyphs. The meeting between Robin and Crocodile occurred not through formal introduction or careful negotiation, but through the kind of calculated coincidence that both parties specialized in creating when their interests aligned. The warlord's need for someone capable of reading the ancient script that adorned certain historical monuments coincided perfectly with Robin's requirement for protection and resources that only someone of his stature could provide. The proposition that Crocodile presented was elegant in its simplicity. She would serve as his partner in locating the ancient weapon Pluton, believed to be hidden somewhere within Alabaster's borders, and in exchange, she would receive protection from the world government agents who had pursued her for 2 decades, along with access to archaeological sites that had been denied to independent researchers. The arrangement promised benefits for both parties, while requiring neither to trust the other beyond the bounds of immediate self-interest. The transformation from fugitive archaeologist to Miss All Sunday, vice president of the Baroque Works criminal organization, represented more than simple adoption of a new identity. It marked Robin's embrace of a role that allowed her to exercise power and influence for the first time since her childhood among O'Hara's scholars. The hierarchical structure of Crocodile's organization provided her with authority over subordinates whose abilities ranged from merely competent to genuinely formidable, creating opportunities to develop leadership skills that her solitary existence had never allowed. The code names and secrecy that defined Baroque Works' operational structure appealed to Robin's instincts for misdirection and concealment, habits developed through years of hiding her true identity and capabilities from those who might exploit such knowledge. The mystery surrounding each agent's real name and background created an environment where her own secrets seemed less anomalous, where questions about personal history were discouraged by organizational culture rather than suspicious in their absence. The officer agents who served under her direction represented a fascinating study in how desperation and ambition could drive individuals to accept risks that rational calculation would normally discourage. Each possessed abilities or connections that had attracted Crocodile's attention, yet their willingness to serve someone whose ultimate goals remained hidden from them demonstrated the power that charismatic leadership could wield over people seeking purpose and belonging. Mr. Zero's own secrecy regarding his true identity created interesting parallels with Robin's situation, though she understood from their first meeting that his concealment was motivated by strategic considerations rather than survival necessity. His status as a warlord provided him with legal protection that she could never hope to achieve, yet his criminal activities required the same kinds of careful compartmentalization that had become second nature to her during decades of illegal existence. The Baroque agents who reported to them operated according to partnership structures that reflected Crocodile's understanding of how personal relationships could be weaponized for organizational purposes. The male-female pairs that characterized most of the numbered partnerships created emotional bonds that could be exploited to ensure loyalty, while simultaneously providing tactical advantages in combat situations that required coordination and trust. The castle that served as their base of operations rose from Alabaster's desert sands like a monument to ambition disguised as legitimate enterprise, its casino facade providing cover for activities that extended far beyond entertainment and hospitality. The Rain Dinner's establishment represented Crocodile's genius for hiding criminal conspiracy in plain sight, creating an environment where dangerous individuals could meet and plan without attracting the attention that more obviously nefarious locations might provoke. Robin's quarters within this complex reflected her unique position within the organization's hierarchy, spacious enough to accommodate her extensive library of archaeological texts, yet secure enough to protect secrets that could destabilize governments if revealed to the wrong people. The privacy she enjoyed there was perhaps the greatest luxury she had experienced since childhood, the simple pleasure of solitude, chosen rather than enforced, creating possibilities for intellectual pursuits that constant flight had made impossible. The maps and documents that covered her desk during this period traced connections between historical events and geographical locations that standard histories had deliberately obscured, her research gradually revealing patterns that suggested the world government's version of the past was not merely incomplete, but systematically falsified. Each new discovery added weight to her growing conviction that the Void Century held secrets that could reshape humanity's understanding of its own development. The subordinates who assisted with her research were carefully selected for competence rather than curiosity, their willingness to follow orders without questioning the larger purposes behind their tasks, making them ideal for work that required discretion above all other virtues. Robin's management of these relationships demonstrated skills she had developed through necessity, the ability to inspire loyalty without revealing vulnerability, to command respect without creating the intimacy that might lead to dangerous emotional attachments. The intelligence network that she helped construct across Alabasta represented one of her most significant contributions to Baroque Works' operations. Her understanding of how information flowed through scholarly communities proving invaluable for identifying targets and predicting government responses to their activities. The academic contacts she maintained from her years of solitary research provided access to resources that purely criminal connections could never have reached. The gradual escalation of their conspiracy against Alabasta's royal family required Robin to participate in activities that stretched the moral flexibility she had developed during 2 decades of ethically ambiguous survival. The manipulation of political tensions, the systematic undermining of social stability, the careful orchestration of conflicts that would provide cover for their ultimate objectives, all represented collaborations, with evil that her scholarly conscience struggled to rationalize. Yet the alternative to such collaboration was return to the nomadic existence that had nearly destroyed her capacity for human connection, the constant flight and perpetual vulnerability that made any kind of meaningful intellectual work impossible to sustain. The compromise she accepted with Crocodile was Faustian in its implications, but practical in its immediate benefits, trading moral certainty for the security and resources necessary to pursue her larger goals. The other warlords whose paths occasionally crossed theirs during this period provided Robin with insights into the kinds of power that the world government was willing to tolerate in exchange for compliance with their broader strategic objectives. Each represented a different approach to the problem of maintaining independence, while avoiding the systematic persecution that true rebellion would provoke. The poneglyph hidden within Alabasta's ancient structures represented the prize that made all other considerations secondary, its potential to reveal crucial information about the Void Century justifying whatever moral compromises might be necessary to access it. Robin's excitement at the prospect of reading another piece of the historical puzzle was perhaps the most genuine emotion she had experienced in years, the scholar's joy at discovery briefly overwhelming the survivor's caution that had governed her choices for so long. The rebels and loyalists whose conflict provided cover for their operations were pawns in a game whose true stakes they could not comprehend. Their passionate dedication to causes that Crocodile had largely manufactured for his own purposes, representing both the nobility and futility of idealistic action in a world governed by hidden agendas. Robin's observation of their suffering created internal conflicts that she struggled to suppress, her natural empathy warring with the practical necessity of maintaining her alliance with their tormentor. The arrival of the Straw Hat Pirates in Alabasta introduced variables into their carefully constructed conspiracy that neither Robin nor Crocodile had anticipated, Their chaotic approach to problem-solving and genuine concern for innocent civilians, creating complications that purely selfish opponents would never have generated. The young crew's obvious bonds of friendship and mutual support represented something that Robin had convinced herself was impossible to achieve. Their easy camaraderie, a painful reminder of what her own choices had cost her. The princess, whose life became central to the unfolding conflict, possessed qualities that Robin recognized from her own past: intelligence, determination, and a willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for principles larger than individual comfort. Vivi's dedication to her people created uncomfortable parallels with the scholars of O'Hara, their shared commitment to ideals that transcended self-interest, highlighting the moral distance Robin had traveled during her years of pragmatic survival. The gradual revelation of Crocodile's true intentions toward his partner forced Robin to confront the reality that even this, most durable of her alliances, was built upon foundations no more solid than those that had supported every previous relationship. His willingness to dispose of her once her usefulness had been exhausted demonstrated that no amount of value provided guaranteed security, that even indispensable people became expendable when circumstances changed. The tomb where she finally encountered the poneglyph that had been their ultimate objective provided a moment of archaeological triumph that was immediately complicated by personal betrayal. Crocodile's attack revealing that he had never intended to honor the partnership that had sustained them both for years. The weapon he sought was not hidden in alabaster after all, the ancient text revealing instead information about Poseidon that shifted the entire context of their search. The decision to save Luffy from Crocodile's poison was perhaps the first genuinely selfless act Robin had performed since childhood, her intervention in favor of someone who owed her nothing, representing a return to moral principles she had thought permanently abandoned. The antidote she provided carried no strategic benefit for her own survival, yet something in the young pirate's character had touched reserves of idealism she had assumed were permanently depleted. The escape from the collapsing tomb with both Luffy and King Cobra represented more than mere survival, but a choice to preserve life rather than simply accepting death, a decision that marked the beginning of fundamental changes in how she viewed her own purpose and possibilities. The act of rescue, freely given without expectation of return, created the first genuine human connection she had experienced since Saul's sacrifice on O'Hara's burning shore. The revelation that followed, her appearance on the Going Merry and request to join a crew she had previously opposed, surprised even Robin herself. The decision emerging from emotional depths she had not known still existed within her carefully armored heart. The explanation she offered was practical rather than sentimental, yet beneath her stated reasons lay the recognition that these pirates represented something she had never encountered before. People whose bonds transcended self-interest, whose loyalty was given freely rather than purchased through mutual advantage. Luffy's casual acceptance of her request, his complete lack of suspicion despite her history of opposition to their goals, provided the first glimpse of the unconditional acceptance she had dreamed of finding during 20 years of systematic rejection. His willingness to take responsibility for saving her life transformed what should have been a debt into an opportunity, a chance to discover whether genuine belonging might still be possible for someone whose entire adult existence had been built upon the assumption that all relationships were ultimately transactional. The 4 years she had spent as Miss All Sunday represented both her greatest success at integration into normal society and her most complete compromise of the principles that had sustained her through childhood trauma. The alliance with Crocodile had provided security and purpose at the cost of moral clarity, teaching her that survival was possible through collaboration with evil, but raising questions about whether such survival was worth the price it demanded. The decision to abandon that security for the uncertain promise of genuine friendship with the Straw Hats marked Not just a change in allegiance, but a fundamental shift in how she understood the relationship between safety, authenticity, between pragmatic success and meaningful existence. The appearance of Nico Robin aboard the Going Merry, as the ship sailed away from Alabaster's troubled shores, was so unexpected that even the crew's lookout failed to notice her presence until she chose to make herself known. Her devil fruit powers having allowed her to board their vessel without triggering any of the alerts or defenses that might have prevented a less capable intruder from achieving such access. The casual manner in which she announced her presence, as if her arrival were the most natural thing in the world rather than an unprecedented breach of security, demonstrated both her confidence in her own abilities and her understanding that the Straw Hats operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from those that govern most pirate crews. Her declaration that she wished to join their crew was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she might have used to discuss the weather, yet the implications of such a request were staggering enough to leave even Luffy momentarily speechless. This was, after all, the woman who had served as Crocodile's second-in-command, who had manipulated events across Alabasta with cold precision, who had demonstrated abilities that marked her as one of the most dangerous individuals they had ever encountered. The very suggestion that she might become their crewmate challenged every assumption they had developed about loyalty, trust, and the possibility of redemption. The explanation she offered for her unprecedented request was characteristically complex, weaving together practical considerations with emotional needs in ways that reflected both her intellectual sophistication and her desperate hunger for genuine human connection. She had, she claimed, lost her will to live during the confrontation in the royal tomb, the betrayal by Crocodile, and the apparent failure of her decades-long quest, combining to create despair so complete that death had seemed preferable to continued existence. Luffy's intervention, his inexplicable decision to save someone who had been his enemy, had given her life meaning she had not expected to find again. The concept of taking responsibility for someone's continued existence was not new to Luffy, whose understanding of leadership had always been grounded in emotional rather than tactical considerations. Yet the application of such principles to someone of Robin's background and reputation created complications that even his straightforward worldview struggled to process. The obligation he accepted by pulling her from the collapsing tomb extended beyond mere rescue to encompass ongoing commitment to her well-being, a burden that most captains would have rejected as impractical and potentially dangerous. The rest of the crew's reaction to Robin's request revealed the various ways that her notorious reputation had shaped their perceptions of her character and capabilities. Zoro's hand instinctively moved toward his swords whenever she spoke, his warrior's instincts recognizing a threat that transcended conventional combat abilities. Nami's navigator's mind calculated the risks that harboring such a wanted fugitive might bring to their journey, while Usopp's imagination conjured scenarios of betrayal and disaster that her presence might precipitate. Only Sanji seemed entirely comfortable with the prospect of adding Robin to their crew, though his enthusiasm was motivated more by her beauty than by any careful consideration of her qualifications or potential contributions to their mission. His immediate declaration that he would protect her from any danger was both chivalrous and naive, reflecting his romantic idealization of women rather than realistic assessment of someone whose survival skills far exceeded his own. Chopper's innocent curiosity about her devil fruit powers provided the first crack in the wall of suspicion that surrounded Robin's integration into the crew, his medical interest in her abilities, creating opportunities for interaction that bypassed the political and moral considerations that complicated relationships with the other members. His questions about how her power worked, whether creating additional body parts caused her pain, and what limitations governed her abilities, demonstrated the kind of genuine interest that Robin had rarely experienced from anyone who learned about her capabilities. The days that followed Robin's recruitment were marked by a careful dance of approach and retreat, as both she and the crew gradually adjusted to circumstances that neither had fully anticipated. Robin's natural tendency towards solitude, developed through decades of dangerous existence, conflicted with the Straw Hat's expectation that crew members would participate fully in the communal activities that define their daily routine. Her reluctance to share meals, her preference for observing rather than participating in conversations, and her habit of disappearing for hours at a time created distance that some interpreted as aloofness and others recognized as self-protection. The revelation of her archaeological expertise provided the first clear demonstration of value that transcended her combat abilities, her knowledge of ancient languages and historical patterns proving invaluable for understanding the mysteries they encountered during their journey. When ruins appeared on distant islands, when strange inscriptions required translation, when historical context was needed to make sense of present circumstances, Robin's scholarly background transformed her from potential liability into indispensable asset. Her interactions with the ship itself revealed aspects of her personality that had been hidden beneath layers of protective cynicism. Her gentle treatment of the Going Merry's various mechanisms, and her obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship that had gone into the vessel's construction, demonstrating sensitivity that her reputation for ruthless efficiency had obscured. The books she kept in her quarters, carefully preserved through years of nomadic existence, provided glimpses into intellectual interests that extended far beyond the forbidden history that had defined her public identity. The first genuine laugh that Robin shared with her new crewmates occurred during one of Luffy's more spectacular failures at basic seamanship, his attempt to help with navigation resulting in confusion that sent them sailing in completely the wrong direction for several hours before anyone noticed the error. The sound of her laughter, musical and unguarded in ways that suggested she had almost forgotten how to express joy, marked a moment of breakthrough that was more significant than any formal ceremony of acceptance could have been. Nami's gradual warming toward Robin was motivated partly by practical appreciation for her abilities and partly by feminine solidarity that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. The navigator's recognition that Robin had survived 20 years of systematic persecution created respect that had nothing to do with combat prowess or devil fruit powers, the acknowledgement that such endurance required strength of character that few people possessed. The shopping expeditions that Robin began to share with Nami, and later with other crew members, provided opportunities for the kind of casual social interaction that her solitary existence had rarely allowed. The simple pleasure of browsing markets and discussing purchases, creating bonds that were simultaneously trivial and profound. Her contributions to these expeditions reflected both her practical knowledge gained through years of independent travel and her aesthetic sensibilities that had been shaped by exposure to art and culture from across the Grand Line. Usopp's transformation from suspicious observer to enthusiastic audience for Robin's stories represented perhaps the most dramatic shift in crew dynamics during her integration period. The sniper's natural curiosity about the historical events and famous figures that Robin had encountered during her travels created opportunities for storytelling that benefited both participants. She gained a receptive audience for experiences she had rarely been able to share, while he received education in world history that far exceeded anything available through conventional sources. The combat training sessions that gradually became routine aboard the Going Merry allowed Robin to demonstrate abilities that went far beyond the assassinations and infiltrations that had defined her reputation. Her tactical intelligence and strategic thinking proving as valuable as her devil fruit powers in preparing the crew for challenges that lay ahead. Her ability to analyze opponents' strengths and weaknesses, to predict their likely responses to various approaches, and to coordinate complex maneuvers that maximized each crew member's effectiveness, revealed leadership capabilities that had been hidden beneath her preference for working alone. Chopper's medical examinations of Robin's unique physiology provided both practical benefits and opportunities for the kind of clinical intimacy that bypassed the emotional barriers she had constructed against more conventional forms of closeness. His professional fascination with how her powers affected her cardiovascular system, her nutritional requirements, and her recovery from injuries created a relationship built on mutual curiosity rather than the suspicion or calculation that had characterized most of her previous interactions with medical professionals. The first time Robin used her powers to protect another crew member rather than herself marked a watershed moment in her psychological development. Her instinctive positioning of additional arms to shield Chopper from falling debris during a storm, revealing that her survival instincts had expanded to encompass the safety of others. The realization that she had acted without conscious decision, that her devil fruit had responded to perceived threats against someone she cared about, suggested changes in her fundamental orientation toward the world that went deeper than mere tactical alliance. Sanji's cooking provided Robin with sensory experiences that connected to memories of happier times, the flavors and aromas that filled the ship's galley triggering recollections of meals shared with O'Hara's scholars during the peaceful years before everything changed. His obvious pleasure in preparing food that she enjoyed created a simple form of appreciation that required no complicated negotiations or strategic calculations, the straightforward exchange of skill for gratitude that had become foreign to her during decades of more complex relationships. The library corner that Robin created in her quarters gradually became a gathering place for crew members seeking quiet activities, her collection of books and maps attracting visitors whose interests ranged from Nami's practical concern with navigation to Luffy's sporadic curiosity about the adventures of famous pirates. The informal education that occurred during these sessions benefited everyone involved, Robin's teaching skills finding expression in ways that recalled her happiest memories of scholarly life, while providing her students with knowledge that enhanced their understanding of the world they were exploring. Zoro's eventual acceptance of Robin as a legitimate crew member was signaled not through any dramatic declaration, but through subtle changes in his behavior. The relaxation of his vigilant posture when she entered a room, his inclusion of her position in tactical calculations, his willingness to sleep in her presence without maintaining constant awareness of potential threats. His warrior's instincts had gradually recognized that she posed no danger to people she considered family, that her formidable abilities were now deployed in service of their collective welfare rather than her individual survival. The bonds that developed between Robin and her crewmates during this period were strengthened by shared dangers that tested their mutual commitment in ways that peaceful coexistence could never have achieved. When marine patrols forced them into hiding, when storms threatened to destroy their ship, when hostile pirates challenged their passage through contested waters, Robin's contributions to their collective survival demonstrated loyalty that transcended the tactical alliance she had originally claimed to seek. The dreams that began to visit Robin during quiet nights aboard the Going Merry were different from the nightmares that had plagued her sleep for decades, visions of loss and betrayal, gradually giving way to scenarios of adventure and discovery that included the faces of people who had chosen to accept her, despite knowing the dangers such acceptance might bring. These nocturnal fantasies, while sometimes disturbing in their unfamiliarity, suggested healing that was occurring below the level of conscious awareness, psychological recovery that would require years to complete but had finally begun. The first time Luffy referred to Robin as his nakama was during a casual conversation about crew responsibilities, the term dropping into his speech with the natural ease that characterized his approach to all important declarations. The word carried implications that went far beyond mere alliance or partnership, encompassing bonds of loyalty and mutual support that had been tested through shared hardship and proven worthy of absolute trust. The tears that Robin shed in private after hearing herself described as family were perhaps the first she had allowed herself since watching Ohara burn, the emotional release marking both an end to the isolation that had defined her adult existence and a beginning of vulnerability that would require courage to maintain. The risk of caring about people who could be taken away, of allowing herself to believe in relationships that history suggested were inevitably temporary, represented a gamble with psychological stakes that exceeded any physical danger she had ever faced. The woman who had spent 20 years convinced that human connection was a luxury too dangerous to afford was slowly discovering that the alternative, continued isolation and emotional self-sufficiency, was actually a form of death that made physical survival meaningless. The family she had found aboard the Going Merry offered not just protection from external enemies, but redemption from the internal emptiness that had threatened to consume her more completely than any bounty hunter or marine pursuit ever could. The scholar who had preserved Ohara's legacy through decades of solitary wandering was finally beginning to understand that knowledge, like love, grew stronger when shared with others who valued its significance. The bonds she was forming with the Straw Hats represented not just personal salvation but professional resurrection, the opportunity to pursue her archaeological dreams within a context of support and understanding that made success seem possible rather than merely theoretical. The demon child who had been born in the flames of systematic oppression was gradually transforming into something her younger self could never have imagined, a person who belonged somewhere, who was valued for who she was rather than what she could provide, who had finally found the friends that Saul's dying words had promised would someday accept her for the remarkable person she had always been beneath the terrifying reputation the world had forced her to carry. The mask that whispered CP9 to Robin during her innocent shopping expedition with Chopper transformed a moment of simple companionship into the beginning of her greatest nightmare since Ohara's destruction. The two words carrying implications that reached far beyond immediate physical danger to encompass the systematic unraveling of everything she had built during her time with the Straw Hat Pirates. The voice belonged to someone who understood exactly what those letters meant to her, their significance as harbinger of the kind of institutional violence that had shaped every decision she had made for the past 20 years. The world government's intelligence apparatus had been tracking her movements with patience that spoke to resources unlimited by conventional budgetary constraints, their agents weaving themselves into the fabric of Water 7's shipbuilding community, with skill that transformed allies into enemies without anyone recognizing the deception until it was too late to matter. The revelation that Iceberg's most trusted associates were actually CP9 operatives demonstrated how thoroughly the government could penetrate even the most secure environments when sufficient time and planning were applied to the task. Rob Lucci, Kaku, Khalifa, and Blueno had spent 5 years establishing themselves as integral members of Water 7's shipbuilding industry, their cover identities so complete that even their targets had come to depend upon their expertise and friendship. The psychological manipulation required to maintain such deep infiltration while preparing for eventual betrayal represented a level of professional dedication that transcended mere duty to encompass something approaching artistic commitment to deception. The confrontation that Robin faced was unlike any challenge she had encountered during her decades of flight from government pursuit. The CP9 agents representing not just superior individual capabilities but institutional authority, backed by resources that could be deployed without limit or restraint. Their offer was presented as negotiation rather than ultimatum. Yet the terms made clear that her cooperation was expected rather than requested, that resistance would bring consequences extending far beyond her own destruction. The ultimatum they presented was elegantly simple in its cruelty. She could surrender herself voluntarily, and her crew would be allowed to continue their journey unharmed, or she could resist and watch as the people she had come to love were systematically destroyed by forces they could never hope to defeat. The choice was designed to exploit her deepest psychological vulnerabilities, transforming her capacity for caring about others into a weapon that could be used to ensure her compliance. Robin's decision to accept CP9's terms was motivated not by fear for her own safety, but by recognition that her presence among the Straw Hats had always carried the potential for such consequences, that her notorious reputation and massive bounty made her a liability that no amount of personal growth or crew loyalty could ultimately overcome. The protective isolation that had defined her adult existence had been temporarily suspended during her time aboard the Going Merry, but the fundamental reality of her situation remained unchanged. Association with her was dangerous for anyone who lacked the power to resist government retaliation. The lie she told her crewmates about her responsibility for the assassination attempt on Iceberg was designed to make her departure seem like voluntary betrayal rather than coerced sacrifice. Her understanding of their characters suggesting that they would be more likely to accept her loss if they believed she had chosen treachery over loyalty. The performance required her to suppress every instinct toward honesty and vulnerability that her time with them had nurtured, to resurrect the cold persona that had protected her during her bleakest years of solitary survival. The pain visible in her crewmates' faces as she delivered her calculated rejections was perhaps more difficult to endure than any physical torture CP9 might have devised. Their obvious confusion and hurt serving as constant reminder of what her sacrifice was costing not just herself but the people who had offered her the first genuine acceptance she had experienced since childhood. Yet the alternative, watching them die because of her presence among them, was unthinkable to someone who had finally learned what it meant to value other lives more than her own survival. The journey to Eni's lobby aboard the sea train provided Robin with time to process the magnitude of what she was surrendering. The bonds she had formed with the Straw Hats representing not just personal loss, but the destruction of possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine during her years of enforced solitude. The family she was abandoning had offered more than safety or convenience. They had provided her with identity beyond her notorious reputation, purpose beyond mere survival, hope that genuine happiness might still be possible, despite everything the world had taken from her. The fortress of Eni's lobby rose from the ocean like a monument to the world government's absolute authority, its architecture designed to intimidate through sheer scale and to demonstrate the futility of resistance through obvious defensive capabilities. The gates of justice that controlled access to the world government's most secure facilities served as both practical barrier and symbolic representation of the institutional power that had shaped Robin's entire existence, the reminder that some forces were too large for individuals to challenge regardless of their personal strength or determination. Spandam's presence as the operations commanding officer introduced elements of personal malice and sadistic pleasure into what might otherwise have been merely ruthless but professional execution of government policy. His obvious enjoyment of the power he wielded over Robin, his delight in her helplessness and despair, revealed the kind of corruption that flourished within systems that placed institutional loyalty above basic human decency or moral restraint. The revelation that Spandam was the son of Spandine, the CP9 director who had ordered O'Hara's destruction, transformed Robin's current predicament from random persecution into something approaching cosmic justice from the perspective of those who had orchestrated her lifelong suffering. The circular nature of her fate, captured first as a child by the father and now as an adult by the son, suggested that some destinies were too deeply rooted in historical injustice to be escaped through personal effort or individual courage. The torture that Spandam inflicted during their journey to the Tower of Justice was designed not just to cause physical pain but to break her spirit through systematic destruction of every hope or dream that had sustained her through decades of adversity. His taunts about her crew's inevitable defeat, his promises that their deaths would be particularly brutal, his gleeful descriptions of the ways their bodies would be destroyed, were calculated to convince her that her sacrifice had been meaningless, that everyone she cared about would die regardless of her cooperation. The sea stone handcuffs that bound Robin's wrists served both practical and symbolic purposes, their nullification of her devil fruit powers, reducing her to ordinary human vulnerability, while simultaneously representing the world government's ability to neutralize any advantage that might threaten their control. The metal's effect on her system was more than mere power suppression. It created constant drain on her physical energy that left her increasingly helpless as time passed. The approach of the Straw Hat pirates to Eni's lobby was something that neither Robin nor her captors had anticipated. Their willingness to challenge the world government's most secure installation for the sake of a single crew member, defying every rational calculation about risk and reward. The sound of combat echoing through the fortress's corridors brought Robin both hope and despair. Hope that her friends had not abandoned her, despair that they were walking into destruction, that her capture was supposed to have prevented. Luffy's declaration of war against the world government, symbolized by Sojaking's burning of their flag, represented more than rescue mission but fundamental challenge to the authority that had shaped Robin's entire existence. The symbolic destruction of that banner was both practical statement of intent and philosophical rejection of the system that had declared her unworthy of basic human rights, a demonstration that some bonds transcended political considerations or institutional power. The order for Robin to declare her desire to live was perhaps the most psychologically devastating demand Luffy could have made, forcing her to confront emotions and possibilities she had spent decades trying to suppress for her own protection. The admission that she wanted to survive, to continue existing in a world that had consistently rejected her presence, required her to abandon the defensive nihilism that had made her suffering bearable. Her breakdown as she screamed her desire to live across Eni's lobby's plaza marked the moment when 20 years of accumulated pain and suppressed hope finally overwhelmed the psychological defenses that had protected her from complete despair. The tears that accompanied her declaration were not just relief at rescue, but recognition that she had finally found people whose love was strong enough to challenge forces that had previously seemed insurmountable. The battle that followed tested every skill the Straw Hats had developed during their journey, each crew member facing opponents whose abilities pushed them beyond their previous limitations, while demonstrating the lengths to which they would go to protect someone they considered family. The individual victories achieved by Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and the others were less important than their collective statement that Robin's life was worth defending against any opposition the world might arrange. The systematic destruction of Robin's restraints was both literally and symbolically significant. The breaking of sea stone handcuffs, representing not just restoration of her physical capabilities, but liberation from psychological chains that had bound her far more completely than any metal could achieve. The moment when her powers returned was also the moment when she truly understood that her captivity had ended, that the people fighting for her freedom possessed both the strength and determination necessary to make such liberation permanent. The revelation that the Buster Call had been activated against Eni's lobby created tactical challenges that went far beyond simple combat, the approaching fleet representing the same kind of systematic destruction that had consumed O'Hara decades earlier. The psychological impact of facing such overwhelming force, while surrounded by people she had come to love, tested Robin's newfound commitment to survival in ways that individual battles could never have achieved. Robin's active participation in their escape from Enies Lobby marked her transformation from rescued victim to contributing member of the team fighting for their collective survival. Her devil fruit powers and tactical intelligence proving crucial for navigating the fortress's defenses while under bombardment from the approaching fleet. The woman who had spent years avoiding combat was finally fighting not just for her own survival but for the safety of people whose lives had become more important to her than her own. The destruction of Enies Lobby by the Buster Call served multiple narrative purposes, demonstrating both the world government's willingness to sacrifice their own installations to eliminate threats and the broader implications of the Straw Hats' challenge to institutional authority. The fortress that had never fallen to external attack was reduced to rubble not by enemy action, but by friendly fire. The irony of their situation lost on no one involved in the battle. The escape aboard the Going Merry represented more than tactical victory, but spiritual resurrection. Robin's reunion with the ship that had first carried her toward genuine belonging, providing symbolic closure to the journey that had begun with her desperate gamble in joining Luffy's crew. The vessel's unexpected arrival at the moment of greatest need felt like divine intervention to those who witnessed it, though Robin understood it as manifestation of bonds that transcended conventional understanding of what ships and crews could mean to each other. The revelation that some of her crewmates had been willing to sacrifice their own lives to ensure her freedom, particularly Zoro's offer to take Luffy's pain from Bartholomew Kuma, provided Robin with understanding of loyalty that went beyond anything she had experienced or imagined possible. The knowledge that people would choose death rather than abandon her challenged every assumption about human nature that decades of betrayal had instilled in her worldview. The funeral of the Going Merry that followed their escape was perhaps the most emotionally complex experience of Robin's life. Her grief for a vessel she had known for only a short time, somehow encompassing all the losses she had never been able to properly mourn during her years of constant flight. The ship's final words, her expression of gratitude for the adventures they had shared, provided Robin with model for how relationships should end, with appreciation rather than betrayal, with love rather than abandonment. The construction of the Thousand Sunny and Robin's role in planning its features represented her full integration into a crew that had proven their commitment to her well-being through actions that transcended mere words or promises. Her contributions to the ship's design reflected both her practical knowledge gained through years of travel and her emotional investment in creating something that would serve as permanent home for the family she had finally been allowed to join. The woman who boarded the Thousand Sunny for their first voyage was fundamentally different from the one who had surprised them by appearing on the Going Merry months earlier. Her psychological transformation, as complete as any physical change devil fruit powers might have achieved. The defensive barriers that had protected her during decades of solitude had been replaced by vulnerability that was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, the recognition that some risks were worth taking when the potential rewards included genuine human connection and authentic belonging. The knowledge that her crew had declared war on the world government for her sake created obligations that went beyond simple gratitude to encompass lifelong commitment to ideals and people who had proven themselves worthy of any sacrifice she might be called upon to make. The burden of such loyalty was lighter than the isolation it replaced, yet it carried responsibilities that would influence every decision she made throughout the adventures that lay ahead. Robin's emergence from the Water 7 and Eni's lobby ordeal marked not just her rescue from immediate danger, but her rebirth as someone capable of both giving and receiving the kind of unconditional love that had seemed impossible. During her years of enforced solitude, the demon child, who had been forged in the flames of systematic oppression, had finally discovered that transformation was possible, that even the most damaged spirits could heal when surrounded by people whose commitment to their well-being transcended political considerations or personal risk. The woman who sailed away from Water 7 aboard the Thousand Sunny carried within her not just the knowledge of ancient history, but the hope of a future where belonging was permanent rather than temporary, where family was chosen rather than imposed, where the bonds forged through shared struggle would prove stronger than any force the world might deploy to tear them apart. The ancient script that adorned the scattered poneglyphs throughout the world represented more than mere historical record. It embodied humanity's right to understand its own past, to question the narratives imposed by those who claimed authority over truth itself. For Nico Robin, the ability to read these stone monuments was simultaneously her greatest gift and her most dangerous burden. The skill that had marked her for death as a child and would continue to shape every aspect of her existence as she grew into the woman who would unlock the world's most carefully guarded secrets. The first poneglyph that Robin encountered after joining the Straw Hat Pirates stood in the heart of Skypia's upper yard, its ancient surface bearing inscriptions that had been carved centuries before the world government's establishment, when different civilizations had possessed the freedom to record their histories without fear of systematic persecution. The text revealed information about Poseidon, one of the three ancient weapons, whose existence the current authorities desperately sought to conceal. Yet Robin's reading provided only fragments of a larger puzzle that would require years of patient research to complete. The message that Gol D. Roger had carved beside the ancient text demonstrated that she was not the first person in recent history to possess the ability to read these monuments, though the Pirate King's inscription raised more questions than it answered about his own understanding of the Void Century's significance. His words suggested that he had reached Laugh Tale and discovered whatever truth awaited there, yet his decision to surrender himself to execution rather than reveal that knowledge indicated complexities that Robin could only begin to imagine. The realization that the Rio Poneglyph, the stone that contained the complete history of the Void Century, was located on the final island of the Grand Line, transformed Robin's academic interests from abstract scholarly pursuit into concrete quest with identifiable objectives. The knowledge that such a monument existed, that somewhere in the world lay a complete record of the civilization that the world government had worked so systematically to erase from human memory, provided direction for dreams that had previously been guided only by hope and determination. The historical pattern that emerged from Robin's growing collection of poneglyph readings revealed systematic destruction of evidence on a scale that suggested the Void Century had contained events so threatening to current power, structures that their mere memory posed existential danger to established authority. The deliberate obliteration of records, the execution of scholars who sought to uncover truth, the transformation of archaeological research into capital crime, all pointed towards secrets that exceeded anything Robin had initially imagined. The ancient weapons mentioned across multiple poneglyphs represented power sufficient to reshape the world's political landscape, yet their true nature remained frustratingly elusive, despite Robin's careful analysis of every available clue. Pluton, the battleship capable of destroying islands, was apparently hidden somewhere within Alabaster's borders, though Crocodile's failure to locate it suggested that the weapon's concealment was more sophisticated than simple burial or architectural camouflage. Poseidon's identity as the ability to command Sea Kings rather than a conventional weapon challenged Robin's assumptions about what the ancients had considered dangerous enough to require such careful documentation. The power to control creatures whose size dwarfed battleships opened possibilities for warfare that transcended anything achievable through conventional military technology, yet the implications of such abilities raised questions about the civilization that had originally wielded them. The third ancient weapon, Uranus, remained completely mysterious despite Robin's careful study of every available text, its very name suggesting connections to celestial forces that might operate according to principles entirely different from those governing terrestrial conflicts. The pattern of concealment surrounding this weapon was so complete that Robin began to suspect its location or nature might be protected by methods that went beyond simple secrecy to encompass active misdirection. The Void Century itself gradually revealed characteristics that explained why the world government considered its history too dangerous to acknowledge. The glimpses Robin gathered, suggesting a period of unprecedented technological and social development that had been terminated through systematic warfare rather than natural decline. The advanced capabilities evident in poneglyph construction, the sophisticated understanding of engineering demonstrated by structures like the poneglyphs themselves, and the global scope of the civilization they documented, all pointed toward achievements that current society could barely comprehend, much less replicate. The figure known as Joy Boy emerged from Robin's research as perhaps the most significant individual of that lost era, his promises and failures apparently central to whatever catastrophe had ended the advanced civilization and ushered in the current world order. The apology he had left for the people of Fishman Island suggested personal responsibility for events whose consequences continued to influence contemporary politics, though the exact nature of his role remained frustratingly unclear, despite Robin's careful analysis of every available reference. The connection between Joy Boy and the straw hat that Luffy wore with such casual pride was one of many details that suggested the past was not as completely severed from the present as official histories claimed. That patterns established 800 years ago continued to influence events in ways that most people could not recognize or understand. The hat's journey from Roger to Shanks to Luffy seemed to follow lines of inheritance that transcended simple coincidence, though Robin's scholarly training made her cautious about reading too much significance into parallels that might be purely accidental. The Will of D that connected various individuals across history and into the present represented another thread, linking past and present in ways that challenged conventional understanding of how historical forces operated. The pattern of behavior exhibited by those who bore this initial, their tendency toward dramatic action, their resistance to authority, their apparent fearlessness in the face of death, suggested inheritance that went beyond genetic traits to encompass philosophical commitments that survived across generations. The relationship between the world government's establishment and the Void Century's end was clearly more than coincidental, though the exact mechanisms through which the current order had emerged from whatever conflict had terminated the previous civilization remained unclear despite Robin's careful study of available evidence. The systematic nature of historical erasure, the specific targeting of archaeological knowledge, and the extreme penalties imposed on those who sought to uncover truth all suggested that the current authorities possessed detailed knowledge of exactly what they were trying to hide. The advanced technology evident in various ruins scattered across the Grand Line provided tantalizing glimpses of capabilities that the Void Century civilization had achieved, innovations that current science could recognize but not fully understand or replicate. The climate control systems on islands like Little Garden, the massive structures that defied conventional engineering principles, and the sophisticated understanding of devil fruit powers evident in ancient texts all pointed toward knowledge that had been deliberately suppressed rather than simply lost through time. The global scope of the civilization that had created the poneglyphs was evident in their distribution across the world's most remote and dangerous locations, their placement suggesting a coordinated effort to preserve information that transcended national boundaries or cultural divisions. The fact that these monuments had survived 800 years of systematic persecution testified to both the skill of their creators and the determination of those who had hidden them in locations where only the most dedicated seekers would ever discover their existence. The language used in poneglyph inscriptions revealed characteristics that distinguished it from any contemporary script, its complexity and sophistication, suggesting a culture that valued precise communication and expected its readers to possess advanced education in multiple fields of knowledge. The integration of historical narrative with technical specifications, philosophical observations with practical instructions, demonstrated intellectual traditions that current scholarship could barely comprehend. The religious or spiritual dimensions of Void Century civilization were harder to discern from the available evidence, though certain phrases and concepts that appeared across multiple poneglyphs suggested belief systems that differed fundamentally from contemporary religions. The references to inherited will, the emphasis on promises that transcended individual lifespans, and the apparent expectation that future generations would complete work begun centuries earlier, all pointed towards spiritual traditions that viewed time and individual existence in ways that current cultures had forgotten or abandoned. The role of devil fruits in Void Century society was clearly more central than their current status as rare curiosities, the ancient texts revealing detailed knowledge of their properties and systematic approaches to their cultivation and utilization. The suggestion that these powers had been more common in the past, perhaps even artificially created rather than naturally occurring, raised disturbing questions about what capabilities had been lost when that civilization fell. The economic systems that had supported Void Century achievements were almost impossible to reconstruct from available evidence, though the scale of their projects suggested resources and organizational capabilities that dwarfed anything achieved by contemporary nations. The construction of monuments designed to survive millennia, the global distribution of information through methods that anticipated future persecution, and the development of technologies whose principles remained mysterious, all required social structures that could coordinate effort across vast distances and time periods. The military capabilities that the ancient weapons represented were clearly central to whatever conflict had ended the Void Century, though Robin's research suggested that the weapons themselves might have been created in response to threats rather than as tools of conquest. The defensive nature of many Void Century installations, the careful preservation of knowledge rather than wealth, and the emphasis on communication across time rather than space, all suggested a civilization that had been trying to preserve itself against destruction, rather than expand its influence through force. The relationship between the Void Century and contemporary Fishman Island provided one of the clearest examples of how past promises continued to influence present politics, Joy Boy's apology creating obligations that had shaped relations between surface and underwater civilizations for 800 years. The Noah that waited in the depths for someone capable of fulfilling ancient commitments represented both hope and burden, a reminder that some debts transcended individual lifespans to become generational responsibilities. The connections between Robin's research and the Straw Hat Pirates' journey became increasingly apparent as their adventures progressed, each island they visited revealing new pieces of the historical puzzle, while simultaneously advancing them toward whatever revelation awaited at Laugh Tale. The fact that their path naturally led them to locations where poneglyphs were hidden suggested that their quest was following patterns established centuries earlier. that the route to the final island had been designed to educate worthy travelers about the truth they would encounter there. The burden of carrying such knowledge while being unable to share it safely weighed heavily on Robin throughout this period. Her understanding of the Void Century's significance, creating isolation, even within the accepting environment that the Straw Hats provided. The implications of what she was discovering extended far beyond academic curiosity to encompass revelations that could destabilize the current world order. Yet the responsibility of determining how and when such knowledge should be revealed rested entirely on her shoulders. The evolution of Robin's understanding, from simple historical curiosity to recognition of her role in events of cosmic significance, marked her transformation from scholar to active participant in the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The woman who had once sought knowledge for its own sake was gradually accepting that some truths carried obligations that transcended academic interest, that the ability to read the past created responsibility for shaping the future. The dream that had sustained Robin through 20 years of persecution and solitude was finally approaching realization. Yet the closer she came to uncovering the complete truth of the Void Century, the more she understood that knowledge alone was insufficient to address the injustices that such truth would reveal. The Rio poneglyph that awaited her at Laugh Tale would provide answers to questions she had carried since childhood, but those answers would also create new responsibilities that would define the remainder of her life and determine whether the sacrifices made by O'Hara's scholars had ultimately served purposes worthy of their devotion. The new world stretched before the Straw Hat pirates like an ocean of infinite possibility and mortal danger, its waters marking the boundary between the relatively manageable challenges of the Grand Line's first half and the realm where only the strongest crews survived long enough to pursue their ultimate dreams. For Nico Robin, this transition represented more than geographical progression. It marked her evolution from survivor to guardian, from scholar seeking knowledge to protector, wielding that knowledge in service of bonds that had transformed her understanding of what made existence worthwhile. The combat skills that Robin had developed during her 20 years of solitary flight had been focused primarily on escape and evasion, her devil fruit powers used to create opportunities for retreat rather than engagement with enemies who might possess superior strength or numbers. The new world's elevated dangers demanded fundamental changes in her approach to conflict, requiring her to transform abilities that had been designed for survival into weapons capable of protecting people whose safety had become more important to her than her own continued existence. The tactical intelligence that had kept her alive through decades of government pursuit found new expression in her role as the crew's strategic planner. Her ability to analyze opponents and predict their likely responses proving invaluable for preparing her crewmates to face challenges that exceeded anything they had encountered in easier waters. The patterns she recognized in enemy behavior, the weaknesses she identified in their defensive arrangements, and the opportunities she spotted for maximizing their own advantages, all reflected growth that went beyond simple accumulation of experience to encompass fundamental shifts in how she viewed conflict and cooperation. Her devil fruit techniques evolved to meet the demands of protecting multiple people simultaneously, rather than simply ensuring her own escape. The Hana no Mi's capabilities expanding through creative applications that had never occurred to someone whose primary concern had been individual survival. The massive limbs she could now manifest for brief periods, the complex coordination required to shield several crewmates while simultaneously attacking their enemies, and the stamina necessary to maintain such efforts throughout extended battles, all represented development that had been impossible during her years of solitary existence. The Fishman Island conflict provided Robin with her first opportunity to demonstrate how her archaeological knowledge could complement her combat abilities in ways that benefited the entire crew, Her understanding of the island's history and the cultural tensions that had shaped its relationship with the surface world, proving crucial for navigating political complexities that pure strength could never have resolved. Her ability to read the situation's deeper implications, to recognize the symbolic significance of their actions, and to communicate effectively with parties whose grievances stretched back generations, revealed diplomatic skills that her isolated past had never allowed her to develop. The encounter with the new Fishman pirates tested Robin's evolving combat capabilities against opponents whose motivations she understood, even while opposing their methods. Her recognition of the historical injustices that had shaped their worldview, creating internal conflicts that complicated straightforward tactical responses. The necessity of defeating enemies whose grievances were legitimate while protecting innocents, whose only crime had been existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, forced her to confront moral complexities that her previous battles had rarely involved. The revelation of Shirahoshi's identity as the ancient weapon Poseidon brought Robin's scholarly interests into direct contact with contemporary events in ways that made abstract historical research suddenly relevant to immediate political realities. Her knowledge of what the ancient texts had recorded about this power, combined with her personal observation of its manifestation in the young mermaid princess, provided insights that would prove crucial for understanding the larger patterns that were reshaping the world's balance of power. Punk Hazard's artificial climate zones and the scientific horrors that Caesar Clown had perpetrated there challenged Robin's understanding of how knowledge could be weaponized. The island's transformation, serving as cautionary example of what happened when intellectual capabilities were deployed without moral constraints or ethical oversight. Her revulsion at the experiments being conducted on children reflected not just personal moral standards, but professional outrage at the perversion of scientific method for purposes that contradicted everything she believed about the proper relationship between knowledge and power. The alliance with Trafalgar Law that began on Punk Hazard marked Robin's first experience with strategic planning that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns to encompass long-term objectives requiring coordination between multiple crews and careful timing. Across extended periods, her contributions to the plan's development reflected both her analytical capabilities and her growing confidence in expressing opinions that might influence decisions affecting everyone involved in their increasingly complex operations. The confrontation with Caesar Clown himself provided Robin with opportunities to demonstrate how her devil fruit powers could be adapted for restraining opponents whose abilities operated according to principles that conventional combat techniques could not address effectively. The coordination required to neutralize someone whose gas-based powers made direct physical contact dangerous, while simultaneously protecting her allies from environmental hazards that threatened everyone equally, pushed her tactical thinking into new areas that demanded creative solutions to unprecedented problems. Dressrosa's labyrinthine political situation and the extent of Doflamingo's control over the kingdom's population presented Robin with perhaps the most complex strategic challenge she had yet encountered: the need to operate effectively within a society where appearance and reality had been systematically divorced, requiring skills that went far beyond simple combat effectiveness. Her ability to gather information without alerting the extensive surveillance network that monitored the island, to coordinate with allies whose identities remained hidden from potential enemies, and to maintain her cover while contributing meaningfully to their mission's success, all demonstrated growth in capabilities that had been impossible to develop during her years of solitary survival. The Corridor Coliseum's tournament structure and the diverse array of powerful competitors it attracted provided Robin with opportunities to observe fighting techniques and tactical approaches that expanded her understanding of what was possible in combat between devil fruit users whose Abilities operated according to vastly different principles. Her analysis of each participant's strengths and weaknesses, her predictions about likely outcomes, and her recommendations for how her crewmates might adapt their own techniques to counter similar opponents in the future, all reflected the evolution of her role from individual fighter to strategic advisor. The revelation of Doflamingo's true relationship with the world government, and his systematic exploitation of his warlord status to conduct illegal activities under official protection, provided Robin with insights into how institutional corruption operated at the highest levels of global governance. Her understanding of these patterns, informed by her own experiences with government persecution, and her archaeological knowledge of how power structures had evolved throughout history, gave her unique perspective on the broader implications of their conflict with someone whose authority derived from sources beyond simple individual strength. The factory workers and toys whose memories had been systematically erased by Sugar's devil fruit abilities presented Robin with a form of historical erasure that operated on a personal rather than civilizational scale. Yet the principles underlying such systematic amnesia echoed the same kinds of institutional forgetting that had shaped her entire life. Her role in coordinating their liberation reflected not just tactical necessity but moral imperative, the recognition that fighting against enforced forgetting was central to everything she believed about the importance of preserving truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might prove for those in power. The battle against Doflamingo's officer agents tested Robin's combat abilities against opponents whose powers had been refined through years of practical application in service to someone whose survival depended on surrounding himself with genuinely formidable subordinates. The coordination required to contribute meaningfully to multiple simultaneous battles while maintaining awareness of the larger strategic situation demanded kinds of multitasking that pushed her devil fruit abilities to their limits while simultaneously requiring tactical thinking that operated on several levels simultaneously. Her contributions to Luffy's final battle against Doflamingo himself were less about direct combat participation than about creating opportunities for her captain to apply his superior strength effectively. Her ability to analyze the warlord's fighting patterns and predict his likely responses, allowing her to position herself and manifest her powers in ways that maximized the impact of attacks she could never have delivered herself. The support role she played reflected growing understanding of how her abilities complemented those of her crewmates rather than substituting for them. Zoo's revelation that the Mink tribe possessed one of the road poneglyphs transformed Robin's scholarly pursuits from abstract historical research into concrete steps toward reaching Laugh-Tale, the convergence of her academic goals with her crew's ultimate objective, creating new urgency around knowledge she had been pursuing for decades. The responsibility of reading and interpreting information that would guide them toward the final island weighed heavily on someone who understood better than anyone else what kinds of truths they might encounter there. The ancient relationship between the Mink tribe and the Kozuki family that had created their guardianship of the road poneglyph provided Robin with examples of how loyalty and trust could transcend generational boundaries when founded on principles larger than immediate self-interest. The commitment these peoples had maintained across centuries, despite facing persecution and hardship that might have justified abandoning such obligations, offered models for the kinds of dedication that her own quest would ultimately require. The political complexities surrounding Wano country and the systematic oppression that Kaido and Orochi had imposed on its population created situations where Robin's knowledge of historical patterns provided crucial insights into how resistance movements could be organized and sustained, despite overwhelming opposition. Her understanding of how similar struggles had developed in the past, combined with her personal experience of surviving systematic persecution, made her invaluable for planning operations that required both immediate tactical effectiveness and long-term strategic vision. Whole Cake Island's artificial ecosystem and Big Mom's control over her territory through a combination of overwhelming personal power and sophisticated organizational structure presented Robin with opportunities to observe how emperors maintained their authority over vast areas and diverse populations. Her analysis of the systems that kept such empires functioning, despite the obvious instability inherent in basing governance on individual strength rather than institutional legitimacy, provided insights that would prove crucial for understanding the challenges they would face in their eventual confrontation with Kaido. The political marriage arrangement between Sanji and Pudding that served as cover for assassination and territorial expansion demonstrated how personal relationships could be weaponized for strategic purposes. The systematic manipulation of emotions and family bonds, creating vulnerabilities that purely military approaches could never have achieved. Robin's recognition of these patterns, informed by her own experiences with betrayal and her understanding of how trust could be exploited, allowed her to provide guidance that helped her crewmates navigate emotional minefields that might otherwise have proved devastating. The escape from Whole Cake Island required coordination between multiple groups whose interests aligned only temporarily, their success depending on Robin's ability to analyze the complex political relationships that determined which parties might be willing to cooperate against Big Mom's forces and which were too committed to the Emperor's cause to risk supporting their enemies. Her diplomatic contributions to maintaining these fragile alliances reflected growth in interpersonal skills that her years of isolation had prevented her from developing. The revelation that the world government considered Robin dangerous enough to warrant special attention even among the Straw Hat Pirates, her individual bounty increases, reflecting their recognition that her knowledge represented a unique threat to their authority, created new pressures that affected not just her own safety, but the crew's collective security. The responsibility she bore for attracting such focused hostility weighed heavily on someone who had spent decades trying to avoid drawing attention that might endanger people she cared about. Wano's closed borders and the systematic cultural suppression that Orochi had imposed on the country provided Robin with contemporary examples of the kinds of historical erasure she had been studying throughout her life, the deliberate destruction of traditions and knowledge creating parallels with what had happened to Ohara that made their mission personal in ways that transcended scholarly interest. Her role in preserving what remained of Wano's cultural heritage, while simultaneously working to overthrow the regime that threatened its complete destruction, represented the convergence of her academic and personal commitments. The alliance between multiple crews and factions that ultimately challenged Kaido's control over Wano required Robin to apply her strategic thinking to coordination problems that involved thousands of participants whose motivations, capabilities, and reliability varied enormously. Her ability to analyze the political dynamics that held such coalitions together, to identify potential sources of conflict that might undermine their effectiveness, and to recommend approaches that maximized their collective strength while minimizing internal tensions, demonstrated evolution in her understanding of large-scale organizational dynamics. The battle for Onigashima itself tested every aspect of Robin's development. Her combat abilities pushed to their limits, while simultaneously requiring her to maintain awareness of the broader strategic situation and coordinate with allies whose own capabilities had evolved far beyond what they had possessed when their journey began. Her contributions to their victory reflected not just individual growth, but her integration into a crew whose collective abilities had transcended the sum of their individual strengths. The woman who emerged from these trials was fundamentally different from the scholar who had joined the Straw Hats, seeking only protection and the opportunity to pursue her research. her transformation encompassing not just improvements in specific capabilities, but fundamental changes in how she understood her own identity and responsibilities. The bonds forged through shared struggle had created obligations that transcended her original academic interests, while simultaneously providing the support structure necessary for achieving goals that would have been impossible to pursue alone. Robin's evolution from isolated survivor to integral member of a crew capable of challenging emperors represented more than personal growth. It embodied the possibility that knowledge and power could be combined in service of justice rather than domination, that the strength necessary for protecting truth could be developed through cooperation rather than conquest. The archaeologist who had once believed she was destined to pursue her dreams in solitude had discovered that some goals could only be achieved through the kinds of bonds that made individual success meaningful rather than merely satisfying. The separation that scattered the Straw Hat pirates across the world, in the wake of Bartholomew Kuma's overwhelming display of power at Sabaudi Archipelago, marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most transformative period in Robin's life since her childhood among O'Haras. Skolas, though the nature of that transformation would not become apparent until she found herself standing on the bridge that the enslaved workers of Tequila Wolf had been constructing for 7 centuries without understanding its ultimate purpose or destination. The East Blue Island, where Kuma's powers had deposited her, represented everything that was wrong with the world government's approach to governance. Its population reduced to chattel in service of a construction project whose completion seemed less important than the control it exercised over people whose only crime had been existing in territories that the world nobles considered suitable for exploitation. The sight of men, women, and children working themselves to death to build a bridge between islands for reasons they were forbidden to question or understand struck Robin with particular force given her own experiences with institutional oppression. The shackles that bound her wrists upon arrival carried implications beyond mere physical restraint, their presence indicating that her identity had been recognized, despite the chaos of her transportation, and that the world government's intelligence apparatus was sophisticated enough to track even those who had been scattered by forces beyond normal human comprehension. The speed with which she had been processed into the labor system suggested preparation that went beyond simple opportunism to encompass systematic planning for contingencies that most organizations would never have considered. The work itself was backbreaking in ways that her scholarly background had never prepared her to endure. The constant lifting and carrying of massive stone blocks requiring physical strength that decades of survival had not developed, while simultaneously providing her with first-hand experience of the kind of systematic dehumanization that the kind world government employed to maintain control over populations that posed no military threat. The guards who supervised their labor showed no interest in efficiency or progress, their primary concern being the maintenance of despair rather than the completion of construction. The conversations she overheard among her fellow prisoners revealed the global scope of similar projects, the world government's use of forced labor, extending far beyond this single bridge to encompass construction efforts across the world that served no apparent practical purpose beyond demonstrating their authority over life and death. The realization that millions of people were trapped in similar circumstances, their existence reduced to service of projects that might continue for generations without ever reaching completion, provided context for her own situation that made individual escape seem almost selfish. The revolutionary army that appeared to liberate Tequila Wolf's enslaved population moved with precision that spoke to years of planning and preparation. their coordinated assault on the island's defenses, demonstrating organizational capabilities that rivaled those of the world government itself. The efficiency with which they neutralized guards, dismantled surveillance systems, and coordinated the evacuation of prisoners suggested resources and training that went far beyond what Robin had expected from what she had assumed was a relatively small resistance movement. The revelation that these revolutionaries had been searching for her specifically for 10 years transformed her understanding of her own significance in ways that extended beyond her archaeological abilities to encompass political implications she had never considered. Their knowledge of her history, their understanding of what she represented to those who opposed the current world order, and their obvious respect for her survival through 2 decades of systematic persecution indicated that her reputation among enemies of the world government was very different from her status in official propaganda. The invitation to meet with Dragon himself was perhaps the most significant political opportunity Robin had ever received. The chance to speak directly with the man who led the world's most significant resistance movement, offering possibilities for advancing goals that extended far beyond her individual quest for historical knowledge. Yet her decision to decline that meeting reflected growth in her understanding of loyalty and obligation that would have been impossible during her years of solitary survival, her commitment to reuniting with her crew taking precedence over opportunities that might have served her original academic interests. The stories that the revolutionaries shared about Dragon's vision for reshaping the world's political structure provided Robin with insights into how systematic change might be achieved. Their accounts of successful operations against government installations, demonstrating that the world government's authority was not as absolute as official propaganda claimed. The evidence they presented of popular support for revolutionary goals in communities across the world suggested that the current order's legitimacy was more fragile than appearances indicated. The philosophical discussions that occurred during her time with the revolutionaries challenged Robin's understanding of how knowledge should be used. Their arguments that historical truth was meaningless unless it could be applied to contemporary struggles, forcing her to confront questions about the relationship between academic pursuit and political action that she had never fully resolved. Their contention that scholars had obligations beyond mere preservation of information touched on guilt she had carried since O'Hara's destruction, the recognition that her mother and the other archaeologists had died for principles that demanded more than passive remembrance. The training that the revolutionaries provided in techniques for coordinating resistance movements and organizing popular uprisings gave Robin practical skills that complemented her existing abilities while expanding her understanding of how individual actions could contribute to collective efforts for social change. Their emphasis on education and consciousness raising as essential components of revolutionary activity resonated with her scholarly background while suggesting applications for her knowledge that went beyond simple historical research. The intelligence network that the Revolutionary Army had constructed across the world impressed Robin with its sophistication and reach, their ability to coordinate activities across vast distances and maintain security despite constant government surveillance, demonstrating organizational capabilities that surpassed those of most legitimate governments. Her contributions to their information-gathering efforts, based on her unique knowledge of government operations and archaeological sites that might contain strategically valuable materials, provided her with opportunities to apply her expertise in service of causes larger than her individual goals. The newspaper reports about Luffy's infiltration of Marineford and his message to the crew provided Robin with her first real understanding of how deeply the separation had affected him, his willingness to delay their reunion by 2 years, demonstrating growth in strategic thinking. that she had not expected from someone whose approach to problems had always been characterized by immediate action rather than careful planning. The coded message he left through his actions revealed consideration for his crew's development that went beyond simple concern for their immediate safety. The decision to remain with the revolutionaries for the full 2-year period, rather than attempting immediate reunion with her captain, represented Robin's recognition that the challenges awaiting them in the New World would require capabilities that none of them currently possessed, that the enemies they would face demanded preparation that could only be achieved through systematic training rather than learning through experience. Her commitment to maximizing her contributions to the crew's collective strength demonstrated evolution in her understanding of leadership and responsibility. The revolutionary camps where Robin spent portions of her training period were unlike any educational environments she had experienced since O'Hara's destruction. Their combination of practical instruction in resistance techniques with theoretical discussions of political philosophy, creating intellectual stimulation that had been absent from her life for decades. The scholars who worked within the Revolutionary Army's research divisions provided her with colleagues whose commitment to truth was matched by their dedication to applying that truth in service of justice. The combat training that revolutionaries provided was fundamentally different from the survival skills Robin had developed during her years of flight. Their emphasis on coordination and support for others rather than individual escape, requiring her to reconceptualize how her devil fruit powers might be deployed in service of group objectives rather than personal safety. The techniques she learned for using her abilities to enhance other fighters' effectiveness, to create tactical advantages that could be exploited by teammates, and to coordinate complex maneuvers that required precise timing, all prepared her for the kinds of cooperation that would be essential in their eventual confrontations with emperors. The intelligence work that became Robin's primary contribution to revolutionary operations during this period allowed her to apply her analytical skills and historical knowledge in ways that directly supported active resistance to government oppression. Her ability to recognize patterns in official behavior and predict likely responses to various forms of opposition, proving invaluable for planning operations that minimized casualties while maximizing political impact. The satisfaction she derived from such work was different from the pleasure she had found in pure academic research. The knowledge that her efforts contributed directly to alleviating suffering, providing emotional rewards that abstract, scholarly achievement could never match. The network of contacts that Robin developed within the Revolutionary Army extended her understanding of how resistance movements operated across different cultures and geographical regions. Each group's adaptation of general principles to local conditions, demonstrating flexibility and creativity that impressed her with its sophistication. The coordination required to maintain communication and support between such diverse organizations, while simultaneously avoiding detection by government intelligence services, represented organizational achievement that rivaled the scholarly networks she had studied in historical contexts. The strategic planning sessions, where Robin's input was sought on questions of timing and resource allocation for major operations, provided her with education in large-scale coordination that complemented her existing tactical knowledge, while preparing her for the kinds of leadership responsibilities she might be called upon to assume during the Straw Hat's future adventures. Her contributions to these discussions reflected growing confidence in expressing opinions that might influence decisions affecting thousands of people, a development that would have been impossible during her years of enforced isolation. The moral philosophy that guided Revolutionary Army operations resonated with principles that Robin had absorbed from O'Hara's scholars. Their commitment to preserving knowledge and protecting those who sought truth creating common ground that made her temporary alliance with them feel natural rather than opportunistic. Their understanding that some forms of authority derived legitimacy from the consent of those they governed, rather than simple ability to impose compliance through force, provided framework for evaluating political systems that went beyond her previous focus on individual survival. The reports that reached Robin about her crewmates' own training and development during their separation period created mixed emotions of pride and concern. Her recognition that they were all growing stronger and more capable balanced by worry about the dangers they were facing in pursuit of such improvement. The knowledge that Zoro was training under Mihawk's direct instruction, that Nami was learning to command weather itself, and that each member was pushing beyond their previous limitations, created anticipation for their eventual reunion that was tempered by uncertainty about how such individual growth might affect their group dynamics. The communication networks that allowed limited contact between separated crew members provided Robin with reassurance that their bonds remained intact despite physical distance. The messages they managed to exchange, demonstrating that their commitment to reunification had not wavered despite the temptations and opportunities that their individual training situations might have presented. The coded references to shared memories and inside jokes that characterized these communications created emotional warmth that sustained her through the most challenging periods of her revolutionary training. The philosophy of gradual change through education and organization that characterized much of the Revolutionary Army's approach to social transformation appealed to Robin's scholarly temperament while challenging her to consider how academic knowledge might be applied more directly to contemporary problems. Their emphasis on building popular understanding and support for alternative systems before attempting to overthrow existing structures reflected strategic thinking that prioritized long-term stability over immediate gratification of revolutionary impulses. The final months of her time with the revolutionaries were marked by increasing anticipation of reunion with her crew. Her eagerness to discover how their individual development would enhance their collective capabilities, balanced by recognition that the family she would rejoin might be significantly different from the one she had been separated from at Sabaody. The bonds that had been forged through shared struggle and mutual support would need to be renewed and strengthened to accommodate the growth that each member had achieved during their time apart. The departure from the Revolutionary Army represented more than simple conclusion of training period. It marked Robin's transition from someone who had received support and protection from others to someone capable of providing such assistance herself. Her development during the separation having equipped her not just with enhanced combat abilities, but with understanding of how individual actions could contribute to collective efforts for positive change. The skills she had acquired in organization, communication, and strategic planning would prove essential for the challenges that awaited the Straw Hats in their confrontations with emperors and eventually with the world government itself. The woman who prepared to reunite with her crew after 2 years of revolutionary training carried within her not just enhanced abilities, but expanded understanding of her own role in the larger struggle between freedom and oppression that had defined her entire life. The bonds she had formed with people dedicated to systematic change had provided her with perspective on how personal growth could serve purposes beyond individual satisfaction, how the pursuit of knowledge could be integrated with active resistance to injustice, and how family relationships could coexist with broader commitments to principles that transcended immediate group loyalty. The archaeologist who had once sought only to survive long enough to uncover historical truth had evolved into someone capable of applying that truth in service of creating a future worthy of the sacrifices that preservation of knowledge had required. The reunion at Sabaudi Archipelago marked not just the end of 2 years of enforced separation, but the beginning of a new chapter in which Nico Robin would finally embrace her role as one of the senior officers of what had evolved from a small crew of dreamers into a force capable of challenging the established order of the world itself. The woman who stepped onto the Thousand Sunny's deck after their underwater journey to Fishman Island carried herself with confidence that had been forged through revolutionary training, her posture and bearing reflecting growth that extended far beyond mere improvements in combat capability or devil fruit mastery. The new world that stretched before them represented the culmination of everything they had worked towards since their first tentative steps onto the Grand Line. Yet Robin understood better than most that the waters they now sailed contained dangers that would test not just their individual abilities, but the bonds that held them together as a family. Her experiences with the Revolutionary Army had provided her with strategic perspective that complemented Luffy's intuitive leadership, creating possibilities for coordination and planning that their previous adventures had rarely required. Her role as the crew's archaeologist had evolved to encompass responsibilities that went far beyond academic research, her knowledge of ancient history, and her ability to read poneglyphs, making her indispensable for navigating the political complexities that defined relationships between emperors, warlords, and the world government. The intelligence she possessed about historical patterns and the connections between past events and contemporary politics made her contributions to their strategic planning as valuable as any combat prowess she might have developed. The Fishman Island conflict had provided their first real test as a reunited crew, Robin's diplomatic skills and cultural knowledge proving crucial for resolving tensions that had festered for centuries, while her enhanced combat abilities contributed meaningfully to their victory over opponents whose strength would have overwhelmed them before their separation. Her coordination with her crewmates during battle demonstrated how individual growth could enhance collective effectiveness when properly integrated, each member's development creating synergies that exceeded the sum of their improved capabilities. The revelation of Shirahoshi's identity as Poseidon had profound implications for Robin's understanding of how ancient history connected to contemporary events. Her knowledge of what the poneglyphs revealed about this ancient weapon providing context for political developments that would reshape the world's balance of power. The responsibility she bore for possessing such dangerous information weighed heavily on someone who understood better than anyone else how knowledge could be weaponized by those who lacked moral constraints. Punk Hazard's artificial climate and the horrors that Caesar Clown had perpetrated there resonated with Robin's experiences of systematic oppression. The scientist's willingness to experiment on children for personal gain, reflecting the same disregard for human dignity that had characterized the world government's approach to maintaining control. Her revulsion at such casual cruelty was informed by personal experience, but expressed through professional outrage at the perversion of scientific method for purposes that contradicted everything she believed about the proper relationship between knowledge and power. The alliance with Trafalgar Law that emerged from their shared opposition to Caesar's activities marked Robin's first experience with strategic planning that required coordination between multiple crews whose goals aligned only partially, their success depending on her ability to analyze the complex political relationships that determined which parties might be trusted and which represented potential threats. Her diplomatic contributions to maintaining these fragile partnerships reflected skills she had developed during her time with the revolutionaries. Dressrosa's liberation from Doflamingo's control represented perhaps the most significant victory they had achieved since their reunion. The systematic nature of the warlord's oppression and the extent of his manipulation of the island's population, creating parallels with historical injustices that Robin's archaeological knowledge helped her recognize and counter. Her role in coordinating resistance activities and gathering intelligence about Doflamingo's operations demonstrated how her scholarly expertise could be applied to contemporary political struggles. The formation of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, following their victory in Dressrosa, created new responsibilities for Robin as one of the senior officers in an organization that now encompassed thousands of pirates whose loyalty to Luffy extended to his entire crew. Her understanding of how such alliances had functioned throughout history, combined with her experience observing the Revolutionary Army's organizational methods, made her invaluable for developing structures that could maintain coordination across vast distances while preserving the individual autonomy that each affiliated crew valued. The road poneglyphs that began to emerge as their primary objective during this period represented the convergence of Robin's scholarly interests with the crew's ultimate goal of reaching Laugh Tale. Her ability to read and interpret these ancient monuments, making her perhaps the most crucial member of their expedition. The pressure of knowing that their success depended on her unique capabilities was balanced by confidence that her crewmates would support her regardless of what challenges such responsibility might bring. Zoo's revelation that the Mink tribe possessed one of the 4 road poneglyphs provided Robin with concrete progress toward their ultimate objective, while simultaneously demonstrating how ancient loyalties and modern politics intersected in ways that could either support or threaten their mission. Her ability to communicate effectively with the Minks, to understand their cultural perspective and respect their traditions while pursuing her own goals, reflected diplomatic skills that had been essential for surviving 2 decades of systematic persecution. The connection between the Kazuki family and the Mink tribe that had preserved the road poneglyph for centuries provided Robin with examples of how commitment to principles could transcend generational boundaries when founded on shared understanding of what was truly important. The loyalty these peoples had maintained, despite facing persecution and hardship that might have justified abandoning such obligations, offered models for the kinds of dedication that her own quest would ultimately require. Whole Cake Island's political complexities and Big Mom's systematic control over her territory, through combinations of overwhelming personal power and sophisticated organizational structure, provided Robin with opportunities to observe how emperors maintained their authority while simultaneously gathering intelligence that would prove crucial for their eventual confrontation with Kaido. Her analysis of the systems that kept such empires functioning, despite their obvious instability, informed strategic planning that went far beyond immediate tactical concerns. The wedding that served as cover for their infiltration of Big Mom's territory required Robin to apply skills in deception and misdirection that she had developed during her years as Miss All Sunday, though now deployed in service of family loyalty rather than personal survival. Her ability to maintain cover while gathering intelligence and coordinating with allies demonstrated how capabilities developed for selfish purposes could be repurposed for noble objectives when circumstances demanded such transformation. The revelation that Sanji's family background connected him to scientific developments that had shaped North Blue politics for decades provided Robin with additional context for understanding how technological advancement could be perverted to serve goals that contradicted human dignity and moral progress. Her research into the Vinsmoke family's history and their connections to the world government's research programs revealed patterns of collaboration between legitimate authority and criminal organizations that echoed themes she had encountered throughout her archaeological studies. The escape from Whole Cake Island that followed their successful infiltration demonstrated how the individual growth each crew member had achieved during their separation could be coordinated to overcome challenges that would have destroyed them before their training. Robin's contributions to their collective survival reflected not just her enhanced abilities, but her improved understanding of how those abilities could complement her crewmates' strengths while compensating for their limitations. Wano Country's isolation and the systematic cultural suppression that Orochi had imposed provided Robin with contemporary examples of the kinds of historical erasure she had been studying throughout her life, the deliberate destruction of traditions and knowledge, creating parallels with Ohara's fate that made their mission personal in ways that transcended scholarly interest. Her role in preserving what remained of Wano's cultural heritage, while working to overthrow the regime that threatened its complete destruction, represented the convergence of her academic and political commitments. The alliance between multiple crews and factions that challenged Kaido's control over Wano required Robin to apply strategic thinking to coordination problems involving thousands of participants whose motivations, capabilities, and reliability varied enormously. Her ability to analyze the political dynamics that held such coalitions together, to identify potential sources of conflict that might undermine their effectiveness, and to recommend approaches that maximized their collective strength while minimizing internal tensions, demonstrated mastery of large-scale organizational dynamics. The battle for Onigashima itself tested every aspect of Robin's development during the New World, her combat abilities pushed to their limits, while simultaneously requiring her to maintain awareness of the broader strategic situation and coordinate with allies whose own capabilities had evolved far beyond their previous limitations. Her contributions to Luffy's victory over Kaido reflected not just individual achievement, but successful integration into a crew whose collective strength had transcended the sum of their individual improvements. The recognition that followed their victory in Wano transformed Robin from wanted fugitive into one of the world's most significant political figures. Her bounty, increase, and designation as part of an emperor's crew, creating new responsibilities that extended far beyond her personal goals to encompass leadership obligations she had never sought but could no longer avoid. The title that newspapers began applying to her, the Light of the Revolution, reflected recognition that her significance extended beyond archaeological expertise to encompass her role as symbol of resistance against institutional oppression. The intelligence networks that now sought her counsel and the revolutionary organizations that looked to her for guidance created opportunities to apply the knowledge she had preserved from Ohara in service of contemporary struggles for contemporary struggles, justice and freedom. Her unique position as both scholar and senior officer in an emperor's crew provided platforms for advancing causes that went beyond her individual quest for historical truth to encompass systematic challenges to the structures that had oppressed people like herself for generations. The responsibility of mentoring younger archaeologists and historians who sought her guidance represented a return to the educational role that Ohara's scholars had once played, though now conducted under circumstances that made such instruction politically significant, rather than merely academic. Her ability to pass on not just technical knowledge about reading ancient scripts, but wisdom about how such knowledge could be protected and applied, created possibilities for preserving scholarly traditions that extended beyond her individual survival. The political developments that followed their victory in Wano created new challenges for Robin as intelligence services across the world recognized that her knowledge made her potentially the most dangerous individual alive, someone whose cooperation could reshape global politics while her opposition could destabilize established power structures. The pressure of carrying such responsibility was balanced by confidence in her crew's support and her own understanding of how historical forces operated across scales that transcended individual lifetimes. The preparation for their eventual journey to Laughtale represented the culmination of everything Robin had worked towards since childhood, Yet her experiences in the new world had taught her that reaching their destination would create new responsibilities rather than simply satisfying personal curiosity. The knowledge that awaited discovery on the final island would need to be evaluated not just for its historical significance, but for its implications for contemporary political struggles and its potential applications in service of justice, rather than domination. The bonds she had forged with her crewmates during their New World adventures represented more than simple friendship or professional alliance. They embodied her understanding of how knowledge and power could be combined in service of principles larger than individual achievement or group success. The family she had found among the Straw Hats provided both emotional support for pursuing her scholarly goals and moral framework for applying whatever truths she might discover in ways that honored the sacrifices made by those who had preserved such knowledge across centuries of systematic oppression. The woman who now stood as one of the Emperor's senior officers carried within her the accumulated wisdom of O'Hara's scholars, the practical experience of surviving 2 decades of government persecution, the strategic knowledge gained through association with revolutionary movements, and the emotional strength that came from belonging to a family whose commitment to justice matched their dedication to each other's well-being. The light of the revolution was prepared to illuminate whatever truths awaited discovery at Laughtale, while ensuring that such illumination would serve the cause of freedom rather than the interests of those who had spent centuries trying to keep the world in darkness. And so we come to understand the remarkable journey of Nico Robin, a woman who transformed the world's greatest curse into its most precious gift. From the ashes of O'Hara rose not a demon, but a guardian of truth itself. Her story reminds us that knowledge, like love, grows stronger when shared, that the bonds we choose often prove more enduring than those we inherit, and that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to let the truth die. The scholar who once carried the weight of the world's forbidden history on her shoulders now stands surrounded by family who would bear that burden gladly if she would but ask. Her journey from solitude to belonging, from fear to courage, from survival to purpose, illuminates the path for all who dare to seek truth in a world built on comfortable lies. Rest now, gentle dreamer, and let Robin's quiet strength guide you into peaceful sleep. Tomorrow brings new mysteries to unravel, new truths to discover, and new reasons to believe that even the loneliest souls can find their place among the stars.